Greetings, everyone. Good to see you. Good to see again a list of familiar names here in the attendees. For those who don't know me, I'm Peter Krause, an associate professor of political science at Boston College and a research affiliate here at MIT in the Security Studies program, where I did my PhD about a decade and a half ago. This is the fourth in a series of talks, which I'll go through in just a moment. In case you missed any of the prior ones, you're welcome to watch the recordings. But very happy to have you here today. I know it's Monday at the end of the semester, and so everyone's very busy, but nonetheless, it's great to see a good number of folks here. And if you know anyone who wants to attend or but cannot attend today, this will also be recorded. So just know that. Also know that as I've done in the prior talks, I'll be taking questions and thoughts throughout the presentation, so you can always put things right in the chat at any time, and I'll stop not just at the very end of the talk, but multiple times throughout to kind of go through those questions as best I can, address as many of them as I possibly can. I know I talk a little fast sometimes. When you get an education at MIT, as many of you know, they describe it as like drinking from a fire hose, and sometimes I feel like that's what these talks are, but nonetheless, trying to give you your bang for your buck in the 2 hours you're going to be with me here today. So I just want to start by thanking the MIT-MENA program. So thank you to David Dolev, Rich Nielsen, Mael Qasim, Sarah Zakaria, everyone in the program who has invited me to do this series of talks. It's been an honor to engage with all of you throughout the fall semester on these issues in the broader Middle East and North Africa region that we all care so deeply about. And I hope to see you around campus or in future talks going forward. So with that, I'm going to share some slides here with you. And as always, we're going to have a great conversation on a variety of different topics. In this case today, focused on Arab-Israeli relations. So, oh, just there we go. Okay, perfect. So, this is the title of the talk today, Abraham Accords and Arab-Israeli Relations. As I mentioned, this is part of a four-part series, understanding different perspectives on international relations in the Middle East and North Africa. Um, if you have not attended or you missed, or even if you have attended, but you're like, hey, again, this is like drinking from a fire hose. There's so much information to keep track of. I'd like to go rewatch or share with family members or friends or others information on this stuff. All of these prior three talks are available, I believe, now on the MIT-MENA YouTube website. You can also contact the MIT-MENA folks. But the first one was on U.S. foreign policy and MENA under Trump. The second one was on Gaza, the United States, and the future for Palestinians. And the third was on the past, present, and future of Iran-Israel relations, which was just a couple of weeks ago. And as I mentioned, today is on Abraham Accords and Arab-Israeli relations. In terms of what we're going to focus on today, there's going to be five key areas of focus. So the first is answering this question: what actually makes Arab-Israeli normalization in relations more or less likely? Because, of course, as you know, there's great variation here. In fact, as a social scientist, the Middle East and international relations of the Middle East sets up very nicely for trying to understand this stuff, because there are some countries that have fully normalized relations. There's some countries who have no relationship whatsoever. There's some kind of countries that are in between, and those things have varied over time. And so we're going to start by trying to explain and actually solicit some answers from you about what factors actually make Arab-Israeli normalization more or less likely, both in the past and today going forward. Secondly, going to focus a bit and take us a bit backwards to make sure we have a common historical understanding of some key historical events in Arab-Israeli relations. So talking about some conflicts, also some peace processes that help get us to where we are today. Thirdly, going to talk about the creation of the Abraham Accords. So back in 2020, under the prior Trump administration, we'll talk a bit about how these accords came about, which countries joined, what's kind of coming next in terms of potential additions or even potential subtractions, although that's a little less likely. Fourthly, we'll talk about challenges today to the Abraham Accords. So the current Trump administration is pushing hard, try to expand the Abraham Accords, add more countries to that. But whether that's going to happen or not hinges on a number of key issues regarding not just Gaza and the Palestinians and Israeli relations, but also relations with the United States, with Iran, with the broader region. So we'll talk about kind of country by country, a lot of different challenges and opportunities for expansion of the Abraham Accords. And then finally, we'll talk about basically the future of international relations in the region, including not just Arab states, but also states like Israel, Turkey, Iran, and U.S. involvement in the region, especially in light of the just released national security strategy of the United States, which you may have seen some reporting on that, isn't a perfect guide, but provides some guide to the Trump administration's thinking for U.S. foreign policy in the region. So we'll actually go to the text on the Middle East and break some of that down together. Okay, so I want to just start with a basic definition here so we're on the same page, because especially in the context of Israeli-Palestinian relations, you'll sometimes hear the term normalization in a slightly different context that has more to do with like normalization of relations in certain contexts amidst the ongoing Israeli and Palestinian conflict. This isn't fully different from that, but when we're talking today about normalization, we're talking about international normalization, the sense of having two states actually recognize the other country as kind of existing and having a legitimate government, exchanging ambassadors, and then making travel and trade possible between the countries. So, again, the vast majority of countries in the world today have normalized relations with most other countries in the world today, but there's a number of situations where there's not, and it's not just between, Israel and some of its Arab neighbors. You also have a lack of normalization sometimes between, say, like Taiwan, vis-a-vis China, or other countries in the world. But if you were to say what's a region of the world that has, some of the least or lowest level of normalization between a country and some of its neighbors, you may be looking smack dab in the middle of the Middle East, North Africa with Arab-Israeli relations. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Okay, so I actually want to start with a question for all of you. So, sometimes I break it up and I do a little presentation, then we do questions, and we will do that today. But I actually want to throw it to you right at the beginning, kind of like we're having a class here, which is to say, okay, put on your hat as a social scientist or as an observer of Middle East politics. And I would love in the chat or otherwise you to give me your answer for if I were to say, what is one factor, what's the most important factor that you think makes Arab-Israeli normalization either more likely? So what factor makes it more likely that Israel and some of its Arab neighbors will have normalized relations? And or what factor makes it less likely? So either that countries like Egypt and Israel that have current normalized relations, what's a factor that could make them break relations? Or what's a factor that could prevent, say, a country like Saudi Arabia or Syria from normalizing relations with the Israelis? So let's go to the chat for just a moment. I'd love to hear some of your answers on this question. All right, I'm going to the chat here. So let's see what we've got. What do you think are factors that make normalization more or less likely? And I'm happy to read and discuss some of your answers before I'll give you some of mine. Okay, a bunch coming in. Um, One says, okay, sorry, I keep saying chat. I do mean Q&A, but many of you have found that. So sorry when I'm saying chat. You put it in the Q&A. So one person says Netanyahu no longer being prime minister will increase chances, eliminating right-wing actions. So yes, domestic politics can make a difference, whether on the Israeli side, and again, you see less turnover of regimes in some of the Arab monarchies, but in countries like Egypt or otherwise, at various points, having certain leaders, whether Gamal Abdel Nasser or Anwar Sadat, I think certainly made a difference. On the Israeli side, yes, Netanyahu, as we'll talk about, has actually really pushed for normalization with Arab states kind of above resolving stuff with the Palestinians. But I don't think you're necessarily incorrect that depending on the Israeli government and their amenability towards whether negotiating with the Palestinians or making concessions vis-a-vis Arab states, that could make a difference in terms of normalization. Another person wrote trust. Yeah, I mean, certainly there's issues here, certainly of incentives like economic incentives, military incentives, security threats, common allies or enemies. But the degree of trust, which is, in many ways quite low between the Israelis and a number of Arab states in the region, and certainly with the Israelis and Palestinians, that can make normalization more or less likely. I see someone wrote U.S. pressure, path to Palestinian state, Islamist takeover of Arab countries. Okay, so let's talk about a bunch of these. Certainly, U.S. pressure and U.S. incentives, as we'll talk about, plays a huge role in these types of normalization processes. So I think that's a key one. Path to Palestinian state, as we'll discuss, that's it, probably the number one thing that countries like Saudi Arabia or Syria or even majority Muslim countries outside of the Middle East, like Indonesia, have been asking for if they're going to have normalization. And then on the other side, this individual is saying, Islamist takeover. So again, we can talk in a broader context about what it means to be Islamist, but in a basic sense, it could be, members of the Muslim Brotherhood or individuals who want Islam not just to be one's personal religion, but also play a key role in the policies of the state, in the society and culture of the state. And of course, it's not always the case. There actually has been an Islamist party, say in Israel, that recently was part of the government inside of Israel, which was kind of unprecedented. But it's not incorrect to say that more Islamist governments in the region or parties in the region are often take a more anti-Israeli stance or a more supportive stance of groups like Hamas or otherwise, which can certainly be a problem for broader normalization between Arab and Israeli states. We've got war with China, government change. We've got recognition of the state of Palestine, international pressure. So yeah, tons of great answers here. Again, you're all doing a great job here in terms of your own observations. So I think this is a great start. Again, I apologize for saying chat. Please put in the Q&A, as 15 or 16 of you have already done, which is great. So let's go and talk more about some of the things that you just mentioned in the context of what actually makes this more or less likely. So, first thing I would say is that I did not design this when I was talking with the MIT-MENA folks, but when I was sitting down the past couple of days, finalizing this talk, one of the things I noticed was actually each of these three sessions touches on arguably the three biggest points that make normalization between Arab states and Israel more or less likely. So, just going down the list, not necessarily in the order of importance, but you could argue potentially yes, but all three of these are important. So, first, as some of you mentioned, US foreign policy. Whether the US wants to push for normalization between Israel and Arab countries plays a massive role in whether that's going to happen. Not only because the US has incentives that it can offer both to Israelis and to Arab states. It has pressure that it can offer and kind of sticks alongside carrots. And also the US, even despite things that the Trump administration and others have said more recently about trying to pull back from the Middle East, the US has been the dominant foreign power in the Middle East for decades now. And so it has a key political, economic, military role whose desires can push countries towards or away from normalization. So US certainly plays a key role. Secondly, as a number of you mentioned, the relationships between the Israelis and Palestinians is kind of a key linchpin for most Arab states and most majority Muslim states. Certainly, as we'll talk about, you've had countries like Egypt that normalized with Israel without a deal with the Palestinians. But for most other Arab states, they have held back on doing so and either demanded there must be a Palestinian state for us to normalize with Israel, or there has to at least be, as one of you mentioned, a path towards a Palestinian state that's kind of clear and irrevocable for us Arab states to then normalize with the Israelis. So that second session about what's going to happen with Gaza, what's going to happen with Palestinian-Israeli relations, that's very key to whether there's going to be further or less normalization between Arab states and Israel. And then finally, what we talked about 2 weeks ago also really matters because Iran looms large for many Arab states as either their biggest kind of regional rival or what they see as maybe one of the biggest, if not the biggest, regional threats. So, a lot of times, normalization deals between Israel and Arab states can be thought of as kind of like balancing coalitions vis-a-vis Iran that many of these states see not just as a military threat, but certainly for states like the Saudis, also see as a threat to who is actually leading the broader Muslim world or a threat in terms of competition or issues regarding oil or other issues with Iran supporting non-state armed groups in a variety of different countries through its axis of resistance. So long and short, even if you don't know it, the three previous sessions on US foreign policy, the situation with the Palestinians, and situation with Iran, you could argue that those are three of, if not the three biggest factors that make normalization more or less likely, depending on how each of those three things go. Okay, so let's touch on each of those individually in a little more depth. So just first looking at a map that we'll look at a little bit later of all the various countries in the Arab world that have normalized relations with the Israelis, right? So Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and to some extent Sudan as well. What do all of these countries have in common? Well, one of the things they have in common is that all of their normalization deals received significant incentives from the Americans to make these deals, right? So Greg Gause, who's, great scholar of the region, particularly the Gulf, has said stuff like this, and I agree with him, which is if you look at these deals, what do many of these states get? Yeah, the Israelis give something, and in certain cases they give a lot. Like, so with Egypt, Israel gave probably its biggest concession, which was giving back the entire Sinai that Israel had captured and conquered in the 67 war, which we'll talk about. But for these other countries, for the UAE, for Sudan, for Morocco, Israel's not necessarily conceding that much. Now, Israel may be offering to varying extents, cooperation on intelligence or arms sales or, benefits of investment and trade over time. But in terms of the major concessions and carrots that these states are being offered, most of them are coming from the United States. Morocco's getting U.S. recognition of Morocco's claims in the Western Sahara. The UAE and Bahrain have major U.S. military bases and are getting access to higher level U.S. weaponry. Jordan has always wanted to be strongly in kind of the U.S. camp in the region. And so having a strong relations with the Americans are really important there. Sudan wanted to be off the list of sponsors of terrorism. So long and short, we're talking today about Arab-Israeli normalization, but the US is always looming there as one of, if not the key parties that's offering the carrots and sticks that make this happen. Even in the Egypt case, where Israel gave the Sinai to Egypt to help get normalization, the US helps to guarantee the Egyptians $1 billion or more a year in aid that continues to this day as a result of that deal. On the Palestinian state point that many of you raised, right? This goes back to something we'll talk about today, whether it's the Arab Peace Initiative back from 2002 that the Saudis led, or the demands you hear today from different Arab and Muslim states, which is yes, we Arab and Muslim majority states are willing and ready to normalize with Israel and recognize Israel, but we have one major condition, which is Israel withdraw from the territories captured and conquered in 1967 and allow for the creation of a Palestinian state on those territories. And we'll talk about the fringes and the different disagreements on that debate and what the various UN resolutions say. But long and short, this has been a key linchpin for all the different Arab states, even though, as we'll discuss, Arab states and their populations have varying degrees of solidarity with the Palestinians, or sometimes for the government selling out the Palestinians. But this, nonetheless, is one of the key conditions they've been pretty consistent on over the past, 5, 6 decades. And then finally, on Iran, what we talked about 2 weeks ago. Again, for many of these states, they're trying to balance against Iran or they're concerned about the Iranian threat. And so normalizing with Israel can be a way of sometimes taking relations that are kind of more in the shadows or some common interest against a common enemy or rival and bringing them into the open and allowing for greater coordination. And if you think about, the greatest alliances in world history, whether it's NATO or various other balancing alliances during the world wars, it's not that those countries necessarily love everything about the other, but they have some common threat, right? Think about like the Soviets and the Americans and the British allying against, the Nazis during World War II. There wasn't love for the communist system or Stalin or otherwise, but there was a feeling of there's this massive enemy that threatens our existence, and so we're going to ally against them. So to some extent, the role of Iran, how threatening and strong Iran looks, also plays a key role here. Okay, so let's talk a bit about some of the historical events that get us up to today in terms of Arab-Israeli relations. So I wanted to start with something that many on the call know well, and I've talked about not this year, but in prior sessions when we talked about the history of Palestinian nationalism, the history of Zionism, and the formation of Israel, the 1948 war. So not to go through all the ins and outs of the 48 war, but in terms of the basics of it, what you see on this map is an overlay of the 1947 UN partition plan, where basically in the dark gray was going to be the state of Israel. In the kind of diagonal pattern here, that was going to be an Arab state or the state of Palestine. Jerusalem was going to be an international body. Long and short, even though the Zionist leadership accepted it and the Palestinian leadership did not, although again, there was discrepancies among both of those parties in terms of who did or did not want to do that inside those debates, nonetheless, people knew that this was not going to be settled at the UN or with the UN Special Committee on Palestine. It was going to be settled on the battlefield, and that's what happened. So after initial back and forth fighting between Zionist and Arab and Palestinian militias before the declaration of the State of Israel, which went back and forth, but the Israeli militias or the Zionist militias did better in, you then had, after the declaration of Israel by Ben-Gurion in May 1948, an invasion of multiple Arab armies that you see depicted on this map, coming from not just bordering countries like Jordan and Egypt, or that time called Transjordan in Egypt, but also expeditionary forces coming from Iraq, forces coming from the north from Syria. Again, some push here and there, but ultimately the IDF won again. And so you can see in this bottom right-hand corner, the fact that Israel gained not just the territory that it was promised from the UN, but also this kind of light gray area where they push back the Arab Legion from Jordan and they push back the Egyptian military and then also the Syrians and some others in the north. So why is this important? Because again, this is kind of the dawn of the creation of the state of Israel, and how right from the beginning you had pretty much all of Israel's neighbors, again, minus Lebanon, in part because it was controlled more significantly by Christian leadership at the time that didn't have perfect relations with the Israelis, but less bad than some of the other neighbors. But all of these surrounding Arab states, to some extent, did not necessarily want to have Israel created as a state, and were doing their best to kind of prevent that from happening. So this is kind of the beginning of relations between Israel and most of its Arab neighbors. Now, I want to turn to you all again and ask you all a question to put your answers in the Q&A, which is, there's some interesting historical puzzles here that I think give us some insights for later on when we talk about the Abraham Accords and Arab-Israeli relations today. So think to yourself about these three questions, and I'd love to see your answers in the Q&A. The first is, let's do a counterfactual. if instead of Israel and the IDF, mostly winning the 1948 war, if instead Arab armies had won the war, right? It wasn't just that Jordan captured the West Bank and Egypt controlled Gaza, it's that the Arab armies actually rolled over and then controlled the territory. What would have happened? Would there actually have been a Palestinian state in the territory if the 48 war had gone differently? So that's question one. If the answer to the question one is yes, you think there would have been a Palestinian state, then a question I have for you is why wasn't there a Palestinian state in the West Bank or Gaza from 1949 to 1967 when you had actually Arab state control of those territories, Egypt and Gaza, Jordan and the West Bank? And then finally, if Israel is so powerful, which certainly Israel is in terms of its military and economic strength vis-a-vis its neighbors, then why hasn't Israel simply annexed the West Bank and or Gaza and or even potentially Jordan, right? If you go back to maps of Hirut and kind of revisionist Zionists, it included not just present-day Israel, West Bank, Gaza, but also Jordan as part of kind of the land of Israel that they claimed. So I'm interested in the Q&A. Answer one or more of these questions for me. We'll talk about them a bit, and then I'll tell you about how this connects to some of this discussion on Arab-Israeli relations, Palestinian statehood, etc. All right, I'll try to go to the Q&A here while keeping the share up so you can see these questions and be reminded of what I want you to answer. Okay, so I'm going to, again, keep them coming, but I'm going to start to go through some of the answers that folks here. Um, there would not have been a Palestinian state. There was not a conception of Palestinians in 48. So disagree a little with that point. Again, I would check out Rashid Khalidi's book, Palestinian Identity, which talks a bit about when people start to use the term Palestinian and start to identify as such. But I don't fully disagree in the sense that kind of the modern Palestinian national movement of identifying fully as Palestinian, pushing for a state of Palestine separate from the Arab states, does start to develop by this time, but is not fully dominant the way it becomes, and certainly by the 60s and 70s. So I think there's some truth to that point for sure. I would just add that little caveat there. Jordan didn't want to grant citizenship or rights to the people in the West Bank. So, yeah, some key points there, right? Now, Jordan, to be clear, did want to grant citizenship, but it was not citizenship as Palestinian. It was citizenship as being part of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. So, just as you had some folks in Israel who said, all of this is the land of Israel and should be Israel, you had some folks in Jordan said all of this should be the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, including not just the West Bank, but also Israel. In fact, when you had meetings between the king of Jordan and some of the Zionist leadership, the king of Jordan tried to convince them, how about you can be my subjects and, you'll be Jewish and you can have some authority, but you maybe not have a state be inside of my kingdom. So long and short, yes, Jordan, especially, the past 3-4 decades, has pushed for and supported a two-state solution, a Palestinian state. But in the early days, they did not do so. And in fact, they annexed the West Bank after they controlled it in 1949. And they didn't give up their claim until the First Intifada and kind of the Oslo period in the late 80s and early 90s. All right, other answers here. Three, international pressure not to annex. Okay, so going to the third question about given Israel's strength, why has it not annexed these territories? And again, by annexation, we mean not just having Israeli Jews who live there, as is the case in the West Bank today and previously was in Gaza, but actually saying this is now Israel, this is part of the state of Israel. So yes, I think international pressure is certainly one of the key factors. The fact that, again, Arab states have not just said, if you pull back from these territories, we will normalize with you, but also if you annex them, for many of them, that kind of closes the door on normalization. And by the way, it's not just necessarily with Arab states, it's also with European states or others who have said, if there is annexation of this, then this could increase cutting off of trade with the Israelis or purchase of arms or even potential boycotts from the state and some of these governments vis-a-vis Israel. So certainly international pressure plays a role. Another thing I would add is, again, just kind of demographics in the sense that, again, when you annex, generally under international law, you need to kind of grant citizenship to the people inside of the territory. Now, again, Israel's kind of maneuvered around this a little bit vis-a-vis Jerusalem, where many of the East Jerusalemite Palestinians do not have citizenship. But to have 2 million plus Palestinians in the West Bank become citizens is something that not all, but most Israelis would not like to have happen. So I think you combine the international pressure with the demographic issue, and those are, the main answer why Israel has not yet annexed most of that territory. Okay, other points here. Yes, and this is what a number of people have mentioned, some of the stuff I was just talking about. Demographic balance, people are mentioning. Palestinian state in terms of winning the war. Yeah, so these are, I think a lot of agreement here in terms of the Q&A. So just to tick off why this matters. So it's correct to say today, most Arab states talk about having a Palestinian state. But in the early days, again, both the Palestinian identity and push for national movement was coalescing. Some of the Palestinian national movement to this period was kind of encapsulated by the broader Arab nationalist movement. So again, a belief in not having Israel, but maybe having a broader, potentially even pan-Arab state. And then yes, for the Israelis, despite their military strength, like if we were fighting this conflict a few hundred years ago, Israel probably would have already annexed and controlled many of these territories. But because of a combination of international law about gaining territory through conquest, especially since World War I and World War II, as well as kind of international regional pressure, Israel has not, at least as of yet, annexed these territories. Okay, so coming back to some other historical events we want to talk about, let's talk about the 67 War, also called the Six-Day War. So in the build up to this, you had leaders in Egypt and a number of other Arab states saying, we are going to, quote, reverse the Nakba, right? So Nakba referring not just to over half of Palestinians being made refugees in the 1948 war, but also the catastrophe from the Arab state perspective of losing so soundly to the Israelis in 1948 and having the creation of the state of Israel. So leading up to the 67 war, you had Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Egyptians blockading the Straits of Tiran down here. You can see in the Gulf of Aqaba, which is important because it basically blocks off Israel's only access down into the Red Sea through the port of Eilat. The Egyptians dismissed UN peacekeepers that were in the Sinai here and started to deploy forces there. And so you couple that with some of the rhetoric, and certainly from the Israeli perspective, the difficulty of maintaining war footing with a largely reserve IDF. And so Israel ultimately launches a strike with its air force against both Egypt and Syria in June, and then ultimately against Jordan after Jordan joins the fight. From the Israeli perspective, this was seen as like a preemptive strike because of all the rhetoric and moves that were made by Arab states beforehand. Nonetheless, whether it was preemptive or not, as we'll talk about, according to international law in most states in the world, they would say, okay, even though there was rhetoric beforehand, Israel not just launching these attacks to kind of blunt an offensive, but then controlling the territories thereafter is something that's not allowed to be done under international law. So we'll talk about that. But long and short, militarily, this was a smashing success for the Israelis. They destroyed much of the Egyptian and Syrian air forces while they were on the ground in a period of hours. And you can see on this map, Israel went from being this light gray territory here to now controlling all of the areas that are polka dotted. So the Gaza Strip, all of the Sinai up to the Suez Canal, the Golan Heights, incredibly important topographical territory, not just because of its heights, but also because it gives you 360-degree control of the Kinneret or Lake Tiberias or the Sea of Galilee, depending on how you want to label it, which matters for an area that has water challenges. And then, of course, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, all the way up to the Jordan River. So this was, again, seen by the Israelis as a miracle and a massive victory, by the Arab states as a massive shock that led to, in many ways, the decline of Arab nationalism and a reinvigoration, in many ways, of kind of Palestinian nationalism. But what comes out of this diplomatically, which is important, is that the UN passes one of its most famous and well-known resolutions, Resolution 242, which you can read. It's actually about a page and a half or so. You can find it online. But the key thing that comes out of this is this idea of land for peace. What is the idea of land for peace? It basically says, okay, after the 67 war, each of the sides between the Israelis and Arab states now really have something the other side wants, right? What do the Israelis want? They want to live in a region, the region that they're in, where every single other state does not actually does not recognize them at the moment, doesn't trade with them, is constantly threatening them or going to attack them. That's not a neighborhood Israel wants to live in. They would like to have normalized relations, right? So the land for peace, the peace side is countries that actually normalize relations with the Israelis. What do the Israelis now have that these states want? They have their land, right? They have the Sinai Peninsula, which was Egyptian land. They have the Golan Heights, which is Syrian land. They have the West Bank, which was kind of Jordanian land in the sense that the Jordanians annexed it. But to be clear, almost no country in the world recognized that as being part of Jordan. But long and short, the UN resolution was, okay, Israel can give back this territory in exchange for normalization with these states that have heretofore not recognized the Israelis, and this can be the basis for kind of regional peace and stability. The issue is, of course, not just in agreeing to that at all, because initially, as we'll talk about, the Arab states generally rejected this initially, even though later on they've kind of supported it, and Israel was rejecting it, at least in part initially, and over time maybe has rejected some of it even more after the Egypt deal. But if you go to the text, really fascinating, UN documents at the time were published often in in English and French. And there's even some difference in terms of interpreting the English and French. One of them says Israel needs to vacate territories captured in 67, and one of them says they need to capture the territories captured in 67. And that makes a difference because the territories kind of implies specifically all of them, whereas territories could imply some of them, and perhaps not surprisingly, each side interprets that to their own benefit. So why does this matter? Okay, you don't actually get any movement initially from UN Resolution 242. As I mentioned, the Arab states come together and they issue something called the three no's, where they say, we're not going to make peace with Israel, we're not going to recognize Israel, we're not going to negotiate with Israel. And then after a variety of attempts to try to, maybe get their territories back through other types of coercion or bombing or diplomatic moves, you ultimately have this surprise attack launched by Syria and Egypt on Yom Kippur in 1973. Kind of in many ways, when people think back to October 7th, 2023, basically 50 years before, you have this other surprise attack against the Israelis that initially breaks through Israeli lines along the Suez Canal, almost breaks through the final Israeli lines around the Golan. The U.S. actually plays a huge role in helping to rescue and support the Israelis here by supplying ammunition and other types of backing. The IDF mobilizes and is able to hold the lines for the most part around the Suez and the Golan. But long and short, what comes out of this is Israel's sense of kind of invulnerability, which had developed certainly after 67. Before 67, there was actually a lot of concern by Israelis that they were going to lose or that they were going to be defeated by the Arab states. By 73, I think there was a sense of Israel won the 48 war, they won the 67 war. The Arab states wouldn't dare attack them. In fact, Israel got some potential warning on that they kind of dismissed. So you had Anwar Sadat and Hafez al-Assad launching this surprise attack against the Israelis, trying to in many ways coerce or regain by capturing the territories that they lost in 67. Now, they ultimately don't capture those territories, but as I say, they kind of shatter some of the Israeli myth of invulnerability, but they also shatter some of the Arab state myth of the fact that Israel can be destroyed and that Israel's going to go anywhere. And so if you're looking for hope these days in the aftermath of these two, terrible years of violence and brutality that I think no one on this call wants and wants to repeat whatever has been happening the last 2 years, you can look to 1973 and say, this was also a very bloody war, but a war that in some ways disabused each side of the notion that the other one was going away or could be destroyed or didn't have to be dealt with. And so sometimes, even though we don't want war, war can have effects that actually lead to momentum towards peace. And you could argue that that's something that happened here. And so you had Anwar Sadat making this kind of surprise visit to Jerusalem, speaking at the Israeli Knesset, taking a very risky personal and political step to kind of make these changes, even though at the time he was getting nothing from the Israelis. Ultimately, after a couple of years of hard bargaining, you get the Camp David Accords, you get the Egypt-Israel peace agreement, in which Israel gives back the entirety of the Sinai in exchange for Egyptian recognition of Israel. And then, as you can see on the White House lawn, kind of the three-way shaking of hands to normalize relations. The next two actors that normalize in many ways relations with the Israelis, the second is actually the Palestinian leadership, and the third is the Jordanians. So the Oslo Accords, again, it's kind of forgotten sometimes because people say, okay, it was negotiations towards a two-state solution that's failed, so Oslo has failed and doesn't really have any ramifications for today. Many pieces of Oslo are still around, one of the most important ones being that the PLO recognized Israel. Israel recognized the PLO. The Palestinian Authority was created despite all of its flaws and criticism of it today from pretty much every actor, from Palestinian citizens to Israelis to Arab states or otherwise. But this was a recognition by the Palestinian leadership of the state of Israel that still holds to this day, not for Hamas that hasn't done it, but for the PLO and the PA. Right after that happened, as was known and predicted by many, watchers of the Middle East, they would often say Jordan's not going to be the first country to recognize the Israelis, but they'll be the second, and especially once the Palestinians do so. Jordan signs the Wadi Araba Treaty in 1994. Again, you can see pictured here, in which Jordan and Israel have normalized relations, which have lasted to this day. Okay, so that's kind of the history of it. Now I'm going to just say a little bit about the Abraham Accords, and then I'll pause for our next set of questions. Any questions or comments you have, I'm happy to engage with them. And then we'll get more into kind of present day and going into the future. So when we use the term Abraham Accords, kind of what are we referring to here? This is generally referring to this series of agreements that was agreed to in kind of the latter months of the first Trump administration. This is a picture you can see of, leaders of the United States and Israel and Bahrain and the UAE, who are all there, showing like, okay, we are now signing a deal that's committing us to normalization between our various Arab states, in this case, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, along with the Israelis, and then the Americans being the key actor in kind of making this happen. In separate kind of negotiations and agreements, you also had those with the Moroccans and with the Sudanese. So when we again come back to looking at this map, this is where things stand today in terms of majority Arab countries in the region that have normalized ties with the Israelis. So a couple of key points here on the Abraham Accords. The first is Trump's relationship with the Gulf states is a important factor here. Not just relationship, which he has a decent to good relationship with a lot of the different monarchies in the Gulf, but also kind of his focus on them as a key center of gravity for investment, for economic development, for security, kind of proxies in the broader region, which is certainly something that prior presidents have pushed for, but Trump has kind of pushed for, in some ways, pushed for more successfully than some of the other U.S. presidents. And so bringing in Bahrain and the UAE, it wasn't something where he necessarily needed to twist their arm. In fact, of these different states with Morocco and Sudan, the UAE and Bahrain were probably, their leaderships at least, more on board with this deal than those other states were because of their already strong relationship with the Americans, because of them seeing Iran as a threat, because of their desire to have closer relations in various ways with the Israelis. But Trump's relations with the Gulf states here is important to note. The second thing to note here, and this goes both for Trump and for Netanyahu, is that Netanyahu for decades has pushed a version of this, basically saying that the deal that the Arab states have tried to push is this idea of the Arab Peace Initiative. First, Israel withdraws from territories captured in 67. You have a Palestinian state. Then the whole Arab world normalizes with the Israelis. Netanyahu has pushed against that for a variety of reasons. Number one, he doesn't want to have a Palestinian state. Number two, he understands correctly that the Palestinian bargaining position is strengthened by having these other Arab states not normalize with Israel. In fact, that's also the Arab states' logic. When they're signing the three no's about no separate deals with Israel, etc., they're recognizing we have a stronger bargaining position when we're all unified, right? Not just with the Palestinians, but with each other. So from Netanyahu's perspective, he's always pushed for normalization with Arab states, basically saying that, A, correctly, if Israel normalized with other Arab states, that will take some of the wind out of the sails of the Palestinians and put them in a weaker position. So again, whether you agree or disagree with that being what you want as the outcome, it probably is a correct kind of political determination, which is again why many Arab states have had strong norms against doing so, because they don't want to weaken that bargaining position. Secondly, from Netanyahu's perspective, behind the scenes with states in the Gulf or otherwise, there have been more and more positive relations and even cooperation to varying degrees over time, especially vis-a-vis the threat in Iran. And so he feels like, okay, there's more potential there than there is vis-a-vis the Palestinian leadership. And then ultimately, I think there's a feeling among some on the Israeli right, including Netanyahu, that Israel, if the more that they can keep pushing for and getting normalization with the broader region, maybe they don't even ultimately need a deal with the Palestinians, right? So it's always been seen by many Arab states and kind of two-state solution folks as like that deal with the Palestinians has to happen to get broader regional normalization. Netanyahu and to some extent Trump have pushed on that and pushed on, well, maybe you can have broader regional normalization without a deal with the Palestinians. And if it comes, it comes later on as kind of a smaller afterthought as opposed to the key thing that's the linchpin in the whole region. So this kind of expansion of the Abraham Accords is part of that. Now, a pushback to that is, if you remember in the last talk when I was talking about Iranian-Israeli relations, I mentioned how you had, in the 50s and the 60s, the Israelis to some extent pursuing what Ben-Gurion called the periphery strategy, which was a recognition that because surrounding Arab states remained quite hostile to Israel and against normalized relation with the Israelis, but the Israelis wanted to have some type of relationships in the region, Israel pushed for relations with states on the periphery, right? Non-Arab and or non-Muslim majority states like Turkey, like Iran, like Ethiopia, that were quite powerful states, but were not majority Arab, majority Muslim states that were kind of at that time committed to not normalizing with the Israelis or even to Israel's destruction. So when you look at this map of like, okay, yes, the first two countries to normalize were Egypt and Jordan, but now what were the four most recent ones? Bahrain, UAE, Sudan, and Morocco. Physically, as well as in reality, this is kind of another version of the periphery strategy, where it's like you're kind of grabbing the lower hanging fruit of countries that, yeah, sure, Morocco and Sudan and the UAE didn't have normalized relations with the Israelis before, but they also weren't fighting wars with the Israelis before, right? There was no Moroccan set of troops that went to fight in 1948. The UAE wasn't attacking the Israelis in 1973. So this was kind of that there's a spectrum of normalization that's not just black or white. These were countries that that were pretty far along in some sense of already not being in conflict with the Israelis and then taking a final step or two to kind of go over that line. What's important to note about that is that that's not coincidental if you're now looking at more core Arab countries like Syria or Lebanon or Iraq or Saudi, it's not something that this same playbook is going to be able to work, at least publicly, but I also think privately as well. It's not going to be something where the US can give some concession and then these states are going to get on board because they already have good relations with the Israelis and don't see the issue with the Palestinians as being that big a deal. Most of the other core Muslim majority and Arab majority states in the region are going to need concessions, significant ones from the Israelis, alongside concessions from the Americans to move forward. To continue on this theme, there was an additional country that is going to join the Abraham Accords, which is Kazakhstan. Did you know Kazakhstan was part of the Middle East, North Africa? They're not actually. But to be clear, the term Abraham Accords, again, in many ways refers to the idea of Abrahamic religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So Kazakhstan is a Muslim majority country. Again, about 70% of the population is Muslim. So in that sense, the Trump administration has been selling this over the past month or so as like, look, the Abraham Accords continue to expand. Kazakhstan is a significantly large country with kind of a growing economy, kind of in the former Soviet sphere, is a Muslim majority country. So it's not nothing in some sense. But again, going to the theme of like periphery, I mean, Kazakhstan is beyond the Middle East periphery. It's not even in the Middle East. And then also, Kazakhstan has had normalized relations with Israel since 1992, basically since its independence. So again, what's actually happening here of joining the Abraham Accords is not even in this case like a country that's at war with the Israelis, not even a country that doesn't have normalized relations. It's a country that already has normalized relations and is not in the region, but it's being added here. So it doesn't mean it's meaningless. You know, joining the Abraham Accords for Kazakhstan is a version of kind of like coming more into the American sphere of influence vis-a-vis maybe Russia or Iran or others. But in terms of moving the needle at all in the Arab-Israeli conflict, like not really, not really at all. Now, how can it make some difference? And why does the Trump administration think of this stuff? You say, okay, well, what are some of the different identities here that are at play? And certainly, you know, Arab solidarity in general or with the Palestinians is one, but certainly someone mentioned Islamist or Muslim identity also matters some, right? You have the third holiest Muslim site at Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. You have other holy Muslim sites. Many Muslims around the world in different countries feel solidarity with the majority Palestinian population, as well as some of the Arab states. So getting a country like Kazakhstan, or as we'll talk about later, like Indonesia, can make some difference in terms of the momentum of Muslim majority countries normalizing relations with the Israelis. It's just in the scheme of things, you can do this periphery game for a while, but it doesn't mean that it's going to put all this pressure and all of a sudden all of these closer Muslim and Arab majority countries are going to make the same deal that they did. So we'll come back to what type of concessions they're going to want, but it's important to note not just the countries that have recognized Israel or normalized and not, but also their characteristics, geographic location, and interest here, which again are quite varied depending on the ones who have done it versus those who have not. Okay, so that was a bunch here. I know we did some questions initially where you answered them, but I'll stop there for a moment and I'll take any questions that you have for me, either on what normalization is, the factors under why it happens, some of the historical stuff we talked about between Arab states and Israeli states, or the creation of the Abraham Accords and some of their initial expansion over the past year. I'll take questions in the Q&A on any of those things, and then we'll move forward into what are some of the challenges today and what might happen going forward. So I'll stop sharing my slides for a minute, and I'm just going to go to the Q&A and try to answer as many questions as I can. Okay. Again, a bunch of them coming through. I'm just going to start ticking through these here. What was the reaction of the Arab world towards Egypt and Jordan when they recognized Israel? Just rhetoric or anything tangible? Great question. There were tangible things. So Egypt, which is the most populous Arab country and had long led the Arab League, which is this transnational body of different Arab majority states, was actually expelled from the Arab League. So that was a big deal, not just symbolically, but in terms of Egypt kind of holding itself up to be kind of the leader of the broader Arab world. They were eventually brought back in a little over a decade later, but there were some tangible things here regarding diplomacy vis-a-vis Egypt and relations with the Egyptians. Jordan did not face the same backlash at all. Why? Because it was a very different context, right? Egypt was a first mover making this deal, even though, again, it's important to note, Anwar Sadat demanded as part of the peace treaty that there would be something in there about peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And in fact, there was kind of like something on that put in and said within the next 5 years, there will be an Israeli-Palestinian treaty. Now, As we know, that did not happen. There was no Israeli-Palestinian peace treaty of any consequence by 1984, 85, but it was something that he recognized this is going to be seen as selling out the Palestinian cause, and around the majority of the Arab world, it was seen that way. And so not only did you have other Arab states that were diplomatically countering Egypt, but also majority Arab populations. There were a lot that really criticized Sadat for doing that. Now, from Sadat's perspective, he was acting in the interest of the Egyptian people, basically saying, look, there's this hugely important piece of territory, the Sinai Peninsula, that borders the most important waterway in the region and the one that we get so much of our revenue from, the Suez Canal. We can't have it function and be in our grasp if the Israelis are on one side of it. And we've tried in 1948, in 1967, in 1973 to defeat the Israelis, and we've been unable to do so. So Israel's not going anywhere, and so Sadat recognized them. In Jordan's case, remember, their recognition came right after the Oslo Accords when the Palestinian leadership had recognized, right? So going to today, what are Arab states asking for? Either Palestinian statehood or a clear path to it. That's what Oslo was, right? Oslo was Palestinian recognition of Israel, Israeli recognition of the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians, and then the idea of, again, next 5 years or so, negotiate final status and actually have, some final resolution, which many people thought would be a two-state solution, although there's some disagreement on that. So Jordan did not face the same backlash. Was there some popular backlash here and there? Yes, because again, not only is Jordan, majority of the people in their country ethnically Palestinian in one way or another, but there was some concern of, okay, you're recognizing Israel. Some people, even from the early days, were critical of Oslo, even though there was a lot of hope at the time. But Jordan didn't face nearly the backlash Egypt did. Also important, of course, to note what's one of the biggest things that happened as a result of Egypt's deal. Sadat was assassinated by an Egyptian. Again, going back to the Islamist groups, there were Islamist groups in particular in Egypt related to the Muslim Brotherhood and some other jihadi groups that were very against recognizing Israel, and some of them assassinated Anwar Sadat 2 years later. So he paid a high personal price for making that deal. Okay, Palestinians are the tail that wags the dog. As long as the Palestinians don't recognize Israel, they have veto power over the foreign policies of the other Arab states. So I agree in general with that statement, right? Which is, as we've talked about both historically and today, if the Palestinians are not getting a deal vis-a-vis the Israelis, that will hold back most of the Arab states. That being said, as we've seen, like it's not a full point because Egypt made a deal without the Palestinians recognizing the Israelis, as I just mentioned. Jordan made a deal with them recognizing the PLO, but not a Palestinian state. All four of these Abraham Accord countries have recognized Israel amidst some of the worst period of Palestinian-Israeli relations. So again, I think your point is historically generally correct that Palestinians are kind of the linchpin or the tail that wags the dog, but their influence and impact has been waning a bit. And that's, again, both the hope that Netanyahu and to some extent Trump has here, but also the concern that Palestinian leadership has. In fact, in one of my lectures, there were a couple of Palestinians in my lecture, and I was talking about, the Arab-Israeli conflict. And one of the Palestinians raised their hand and said, Arab-Israeli conflict, like there is no Arab-Israeli conflict. We think the Arab states are basically in league with and, working with the Israelis. So it's interesting the different perspectives on this, because again, you're not wrong that the Palestinian relations with the Israelis play a huge role in how Arab states feel. But for many Palestinians, they feel like the Arab states are just kind of selling them out one by one. So interesting to think about that. How about Tunisia and Algeria? Getting a little further afield here, so not like the full periphery, but states that are a little less involved. But I will say Algeria is an interesting one. I've spent time actually doing research in Algeria for my first book. I wrote a chapter on their war of independence vis-a-vis the French and their national movement. They styled themselves in part because the group that still leads Algeria to this day is the one that won independence against the French in 1962, the FLN. They still style themselves as kind of this revolutionary government that supports the Palestinians, that supports kind of broader revolutions vis-a-vis, kind of imperialist influence. So the Algerians are one of the least likely states to recognize the Israelis. Tunisians a little bit more mixed, especially after the regime change that happened in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, but they're both focused a lot on domestic stuff. I don't see either of them as being a key next mover here. I think they would move with the broader Arab region, but between the two, Tunisia would be more likely to normalize with the Israelis than Algeria would these days and historically. Although Egypt and Jordan signed peace treaties with Israel, they have not achieved full normalization. Should normalization also encompass the attitudes and relations between populations, given that popular acceptance and normal social ties remain lacking? Okay, excellent point, right? So I didn't bring this slide today, but I presented it in prior talks, which is this idea of kind of like warm peace versus cold peace, right? So in kind of the strict diplomatic term, When I say normalization, the definition I'm using is, do you recognize the other state's existence, exchange ambassadors, allow trade and travel, etc.? But this person's correct to say, when you look at the peace with Egypt and Israel, or the peace with Egypt and Jordan, excuse me, Israel and Jordan, people often describe it as a cold peace. Why? Because yes, there are plane flights that go between them. You can travel, but most Israelis are not going to Egypt and vice versa. There's not massive trade beyond some gas deals here or there. We'll talk about one of those in a moment. And so normalization in this case means we don't fight wars against each other anymore. But it doesn't mean that, like, culturally or otherwise, we really get along, like the other, teach positively about the other in our schools, etc. So you're not wrong that I'm talking today about kind of that first step of normalization, which is not fighting wars anymore, having diplomatic relations. But certainly that wouldn't mean the story is over. And the story is certainly not over in, say, Egyptian Israeli or Jordanian Israeli or any of the other country relations with Israel, because most of these are still cold pieces where the people still have a lot of mistrust and animosity at the popular level vis-a-vis the populations and the governments. And that's only something that I think is going to change over years or even generations of these relations getting better and the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians or others kind of going away. As long as that's not the case, countries may not be fighting wars, but normalizing kind of at the grassroots level will remain a very distant possibility. So I think that's a great point. The likelihood of Pakistan joining the Abraham Accords. Interesting. I kind of put Pakistan between, a country like the UAE or Bahrain, in terms of countries that have check a lot of the boxes of being on the periphery, seeing Iran as a threat, wanting to be in the U.S. alliance. Like Pakistan has some of those things, but Pakistan also styles itself as being one of the broader leaders of the Muslim world, having solidarity with the Palestinians. They're obviously very concerned about, relations with the Americans vis-a-vis India, etc. So I put Pakistan not as an impossible one, but a less likely one than, say, certainly a country like Kazakhstan or even a country like Indonesia to some extent, because they still are kind of on the edges of the region and have both connections with and rivalries with, countries like Iran or Afghanistan or India or others that are not fully divorced from some of the stuff in the region. So I wouldn't see Pakistan as one of the next movers, but I could see them as a more likely mover than, say, like a Syria or an Algeria, if that makes sense. Okay, a couple other questions, then I'll go back to some more discussion and lecture. But again, I will come back to some of these questions in a future question section. Do I think there was an opportunity to expand Abraham Accords before October 7th? Yes and no. As we'll talk about, the October 7th attacks and the Israeli invasion of Gaza and all of the death and destruction that has occurred is the number one issue today that drives a lot of Arab states to have less positive relations vis-a-vis Israel. So either states that don't have normalization, not wanting to, or as I'll show you in a moment, states that have normalized with the Israelis, pulling back or being critical to varying degrees. So do I think October 7th and the Israeli response in Gaza has pushed parties further apart and made normalization, at least in the short term, less likely? Yes. So was there an opportunity before October 7th to expand? Yes, to some extent, but also important to note, it was tried. It's not like it wasn't attempted. So some of these same issues still remained. Final question I'll answer for now. Well, I'll do two quick ones here because I see two quick questions. If Kazakhstan already recognized Israel, what does it even mean to join the Abraham Accords? Okay, great question. To some extent, that's still going to be answered because, again, when these things get announced, the specifics of the details really can kind of come later. But you're not wrong to imply maybe not necessarily that much. To me, it can signal, okay, maybe now there'll be some type of investment or trade agreements that will be, have momentum behind them because of this between Kazakhstan and Israel. Maybe Kazakhstan will have some type of greater deal vis-a-vis the Americans, could be on trade or arms or diplomatic initiatives or otherwise. But yeah, it's not like an overnight change in any major way for the reasons that I mentioned that you question here. Final question I'll answer for now. What is Iran's position re the Abraham Accords? Is Iran trying to get other Arab countries to oppose the Accords? 100% yes. So Iran is a country that not only does not have normalized relations with the Israelis, but as I talked about last session, I encourage you to watch that video if you were not there. Is still to this day kind of committed to Israel's destruction, does not want other countries or actors to normalize with the Israelis, sees Israel as, an imperial colonial power, you can go down all the list of all these things that Iran thinks. So Iran is adamantly opposed to the Abraham Accords, very against other states joining it, and is doing whatever it can in various ways to try to prevent that from happening. So, great question. Okay, let's go back to some present day stuff, and then again, I know there's more Q&A. I'll answer some of those in a subsequent Q&A session, as well as I'm sure there'll be more from this stuff I'm going to talk about now. Okay, so what are the challenges for the Abraham Accords today? And there's a lot to talk about here, so let me go through some of these countries and some of these issues one by one. So first, as I just mentioned a minute ago, these are some news stories from Reuters, from Al Jazeera, from other newspapers in the region in the months after October 7th and Israel's invasion of Gaza. And what do you see? Bahrain, again, a country who's part of the Abraham Accords, at one point recalls their ambassador. So you may see this sometimes. Recalling an ambassador does not mean an end of normalized relations, but it's kind of a mid to high level diplomatic signal of displeasure with whatever the other country is doing. So Bahrain does this. In Morocco, you saw some of these protests that were angry and that Moroccans were saying Morocco should actually cut its ties with the Israelis. Again, that did not happen, but you can see some of the popular discontent. I didn't put a slide in here today, but if you look at polls from the Arab Barometer or other regional polling of the Middle East, North Africa, you get 80, 90% of almost every population in the region saying our country should not have normalized relations with the Israelis. And again, those were already pretty high, but they certainly have spiked even higher in the past 2 years. And then again, even a country like Jordan, that has some degree of cooperation with the Israelis, at least publicly, has said, okay, we're going to pause at various points. They paused this energy deal with the Israelis and the UAE or paused a water deal. Now, behind the scenes, Jordan cooperates with the Israelis much more than kind of their foreign minister and others say publicly. There still is a lot of security cooperation. When Iran was shooting missiles and drones towards Israel, Jordan shot some of them down, or some of them were shot down over Jordanian territory, kind of both to some extent. But at least publicly, there's been greater strains in the relationship between Jordan and Israel than there's been in a while. There have been major protests in Amman and elsewhere in Jordan vis-a-vis the Israelis. Now, the Jordanian government tamps down a lot of those protests because they're very concerned that those protests will not just be targeted toward the Israelis, but also towards the Jordanian king and criticize him for his relations with the Israelis. But long and short, you can see even among Abraham Accord countries or prior countries that have normalized with the Israel, the past 2 years have been, very fraught in terms of diplomacy and relationships. Now, I want to bring back a point that I've raised in prior talks, which is going to the points that some of you raised in the Q&A, like what's the role of October 7th? There was certainly some thinking, and I think still is to this day, that one of the motivations for Hamas for the October 7th attacks was actually to spoil normalization. Because you remember, not under Trump, but under Biden, under the Biden administration, you had increasing discussions with the Saudis to try to get either a peace deal with the Americans first and then the Israelis, or some broader Israeli-Saudi normalization. And the October 7th attacks happen amidst like the months when this is really being pushed by the Biden administration. Now, I push back a bit on this narrative because sometimes people sell this as like the main motivation for Hamas, which I don't think it is. When you look back to the timing of when Hamas was planning the October 7th attacks, going back not just months, but years, a lot of it dovetails before the push for Saudi normalization. It dovetails with some of the tensions over the Temple Mount / the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, and the last time Hamas fired rockets into Jerusalem in 2021. But do I think this is there in the background? Sure. And do I think Hamas, like Iran, is really upset about the idea of normalizing between Arab states and the Israelis? Yes. And by the way, that's not limited to Hamas. The Palestinian Authority and most Palestinians are also up in arms over this, right? It goes back to the Palestinian I had in my class who said, we feel like the Arab states are selling us out. It's not that all Palestinians are against normalization with the Israelis. It's that they don't want these Arab states to normalize with the Israelis and sell out the Palestinians along the way, right? So they feel like the Arab states have been at some points and should be supporting them to get Palestinian freedom or statehood and then have normalization. So Hamas certainly doesn't want this, but to be clear, it's not just Hamas that kind of feels that way among the Palestinians. So to come back to a slide I showed you in a prior talk, but just to reiterate it here, what does this kind of alliance or normalization look like? Obviously, the Biden administration or the Trump administration would love to have Saudi-Israeli normalization directly. But given that the Saudis have been hesitant to do that absent a Palestinian state or steps towards Palestinian statehood, the idea at various points has been, okay, what if the US and the Saudis have a new kind of security arrangement that then the Israelis kind of join later amidst negotiation with the Palestinians or otherwise, right? So this is kind of the idea here, both as a balance against Iran, keep the Chinese investment more out of Saudi Arabia, lock the Americans and Saudis closer into a security alliance alongside the Israelis. This is the basic idea of it. Now, as you may have seen just over the past couple weeks, there was a big visit from the leader of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, with President Trump. And what did you get out of it? The Saudis got something that they've wanted that the Qataris have, which is designation as a major non-NATO ally, right? So that basically gives you a higher designation in terms of potential arms sales and closeness of the connection with the Americans. President Trump has said that the Saudis are now going to get F-35 warplanes. A couple important points there. Number one, The Qataris and some other states have also been promised this and haven't gotten them yet. So just because it's said it's going to happen does not mean it's going to happen. And it's certainly not going to happen in like the next month or two. So we'll see whether the Saudis actually get F-35s. Why would that be an issue? Number one, Trump could be saying this as a way to be like, okay, yeah, you're going to get this, but then we'll actually deliver if the Saudis take further steps via the Israelis. There's also the issue that the Americans are committed diplomatically to Israel having a qualitative military edge over all of its surrounding states, even those that are, have normalized relations with it. So this is one of the sticking points for the Americans and for the Trump administration here is simultaneously what do the Saudis and the Qataris, sorry, Qataris for sure, but they're not part of this. The Saudis and the Emiratis and others want, they want closer American security guarantees and access to high level American weaponry. But for the Israeli part, even though they like normalizing with the Emiratis and would like to normalize with the Saudis, they want to do so without losing their qualitative military edge. So there's kind of a catch-22 issue here of can the Americans and the Israelis and the Saudis and the Emiratis like square the circle of trying to satisfy the Israelis on wanting to have their qualitative military edge, but those Arab states wanting to get higher quality military stuff from the Americans, and how do you balance those things? In terms of the reporting, and again, Barack Ravid, I still hold up as one of, if not the best reporters on this. He has seemingly a lot of inside sources among the American leadership and the Trump administration and among Netanyahu's coalition. Excuse me. He reported that the Trump administration raised this idea of Saudi joining the Abraham Accords, but there was pretty strong pushback by the Saudis. As to be fair, there's been by the Saudis for years now, saying that that can only happen when there's a clear path towards a Palestinian state, which they don't think is on the table right now. So, what does this deal show? It shows a little bit more the desire for closer relations with the Saudis and the Americans between the current administrations, an openness to normalizing with the Israelis, but still key conditions there that not just the Americans, but the Israelis may have to make in terms of concessions to get the Saudis on board. Another thing to show the seriousness of the Saudis on this issue is something that's fallen a little bit in the background over the past couple months, but was certainly a big deal over the summer and certainly is still ongoing and could become more important later, which is this kind of New York declaration that was led by the Saudis and the French, but also had a number of other Middle Eastern and European states as part of it. This was in some ways part of this wave of recognition of the state of Palestine, but also really a push by Arab and European leaders to say, okay, if the Biden administration is going to kind of not really be pushing for Israeli-Palestinian peace, or if the Trump administration is going to push for it, but not really push for a two-state solution, we, the Arab states and the European states, still hold really strongly to the idea that the two-state solution is the just and correct outcome that can get regional peace and stabilization. So we're going to push that, even though the Americans have long been kind of the key motivators and mobilizers for regional discussions on this stuff. Now the Arab and European states are going to take some of the lead on this. So this has fallen to the background a bit amidst the Trump 20-point plan and the ceasefire in Gaza, but it's certainly still there, and it's part of the fact that the Saudis, again, are taking this stuff very seriously, which, as I mentioned previously, goes back to the Arab Peace Initiative from 2002, where they said, we and all Arab states, and actually all Muslim majority states, absent Iran pretty much, are ready to normalize with Israel, but we need Israel to pull back beyond the 67 borders and allow for a Palestinian state to emerge. Now, the devil can be in the details on this stuff, right? For pretty much all Israelis, not just Israelis on the right, but Israelis on the center and left, the idea of withdrawing from all of the territory captured in 67 is a non-starter, because even Israelis who feel like, okay, we're willing to give up the Golan, we're willing to give up most of the West Bank and Gaza for a Palestinian state, for most Israelis, you do not get a desire to give up East Jerusalem and the Temple Mount and the Western Wall and these types of things. So even though these are the standards that the states are holding to, I do think there's a bargaining range in there where the Israelis would not withdraw from all of these territories, but you would get the Saudis and other states supporting a deal and normalizing with Israel if there's a Palestinian state and is, the majority of the West Bank and Gaza and parts of East Jerusalem, again, a la the Clinton parameters or Taba or some of these other negotiations. So despite all of the animosity and despite the continued push for greater control, I do think a deal like that at least would be amenable to the Arab states, even though they proclaim publicly it has to be all of the 67 borders. Now, other challenges that have arisen here, right? We talked in a prior talk about the Israeli strike in Qatar. it's not still reverberating the same way it was, a few months ago, but it did reverberate with a lot of these Gulf states at the time because, again, you had this country that was a major non-NATO ally with a massive U.S. military base, nonetheless facing this strike from the Israelis, which, to be clear, was not a strike against like the Qatari leadership, but against Hamas leaders who were gathering to discuss the ceasefire plan, but nonetheless did not kill the Hamas leaders it was going after, did end up killing a Qatari security officer. And so what we saw in the aftermath of this was someone mentioned Pakistan before, this mutual defense pact between the Saudis and the Pakistanis, which seemed to imply that the Saudis, in certain circumstances, could be under a Pakistani nuclear umbrella. You had Egypt floating, again, they had this before and it's been defeated, but floating again this idea of Arab NATO, which would kind of exclude and to some extent balance against the Israelis. So this strike by Israel vis-a-vis Qatar, I think made many Arab states feel like, yes, we see like many of us see Iran as a threat. We're concerned about America maybe kind of leading the region or have mixed, feelings about the Americans, but many of them increasingly see Israel as a threat in ways maybe they hadn't before because of Israel's increasing stridency vis-a-vis, attacks in Iran, attacks in Syria, ongoing attacks in Lebanon, attacks against, in Qatar. So for many Arab states, they were like, I'm not sure if being tied to the Americans will protect us because the Qataris are tied to the Americans. They got attacked. Go back to Hosni Mubarak being overthrown in the Arab Spring. Many Gulf states looked at that and said, the Americans won't pull our chestnuts out of the fire if we face domestic, problems. So long and short, this has been one of the challenges of the Abraham Accords, a concern that if Israel's not a direct threat to some of these states, it certainly is having a more muscular foreign policy that's not afraid to use force in surrounding countries, even against American allies, and that's been concerning to countries in the region. Now, in terms of the fallout of this, I think this picture came online just after I did my first talk, but I think it's a fascinating one. This was one of the last times Netanyahu was in the White House, and you can see, again, these pictures are not released by accident. This is Netanyahu calling the leadership of Qatar, seemingly with a script in front of him, kind of like apologizing to varying degrees for the strike the Israelis did. Now, this to me is, kind of a humorous photo in some ways, but it's interesting to think about the logic behind releasing this photo and why each actor actually in this photo could actually support it. So for the Trump administration, the Qataris gave him this big plane. He designated them major non-NATO ally status. He actually, after this, there was a UN resolution that criticized the strike on Qatar, and the US did not veto it. So it went through the Security Council, which is very rare. Anything that's in any ways targeting or criticizing the Israelis, the US usually vetoes that at the Security Council. The US did not do that. The Trump administration actually gave Qatar security guarantees, which is, again, from many people's perspective, crazy in the sense that, usually security guarantees are limited to like countries in the NATO alliance, where an attack on any country in NATO under Article 5 is treated an attack on all. But the US gave, under the Trump administration, Qatar varying degrees of security guarantees. And then, seemingly, from Trump administration's perspective, this is not coincidental. He's holding the phone basically saying, Netanyahu, you need to apologize. And he's signaling to the Qataris, look, I take this seriously. We didn't know about this, even though he probably did know about it about an hour before, but that's another debate. We don't want this to happen, and I'm making Netanyahu apologize, and this won't happen again. That's why Trump and the Trump administration wanted to take this photo and release this photo. Now, you might say, okay, Netanyahu looks like he's being pushed around here. He wouldn't necessarily like this photo being released, but I can tell you a story why he would, which is for many of his right-wing allies, they see Qatar as a huge problem, not just in terms of previous support for Hamas, which of course the Netanyahu administration was okay with for a while, but now is not, but also Qatar supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar, having relations with Iran, etc. So apologizing to the Qataris is the last thing that many in Netanyahu's coalition want him to do. But having it be like this, where it's like, look, Trump made me do this, I had to do this, etc. This isn't something I'm doing my own free will, can actually play better for Netanyahu. It makes him look a little weak in some ways, but it also makes it look like I'm being forced to do this. This is not what I want to do. And so, there you kind of go. But again, sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words, or at least interesting in terms of some of these regional dynamics. Also interesting to note, in the first talk, if you remember, this has kind of been forgotten a little bit, and it's not the biggest deal, but in the first talk I did, Trump's plan was a 21-point plan. But now in the news, you hear it discussed just as a 20-point plan. It's kind of like, did a point get dropped along the way? Yeah, the Qatari point got dropped. So the initial plan, this was what the Times of Israel and other newspapers were reporting was the 21-point plan. Ultimately, the 20-point plan was published. Why? Because of that phone call, where initially the 21-point plan had in it, quote, Israel agrees not to carry out future strikes in Qatar. The U.S. and the international community acknowledge Doha's important mediating role in the Gaza conflict. That was removed. That's no longer in the plan. So that's why it's a 20-point plan, not a 21-point plan like it was when it was being floated. And I explained it to you in the first session. Okay, let me say a couple things about Qatar and then I'll go around to a couple of other countries in the region. Because to be clear, Qatar is not a country that's about to normalize with Israel. The countries that could be on the border of doing so would be more like a Saudi, maybe Oman or some other countries in the Gulf. I don't see Qatar as being close to doing so, but let's talk a little about them because they're an interesting linchpin here, as again, the country that has most recently been diplomatically and economically supporting, folks in Gaza as well as Hamas. They have relations with Iran alongside the Americans, alongside Arab states. They've become more muscular in their foreign policy over the past decade or two, supporting a lot of Islamist groups. They also have a lot of ties with different educational institutions in the United States, which has led to some pushback domestically in the US. But again, a lot of this has been fueled by the fact that they have a lot of natural wealth in terms of gas and oil, and one of the highest GDP per capita in the world. So even before October 7th, in the past couple of years, they've built some of their international profile through negotiations. So you can see on the top left, this is Khaled Meshal alongside, Abu Mazen, trying to bring the Palestinians together. They hosted the Taliban at various points and were hosting talks with the future of Afghanistan. They've had various, Doha rounds of other types of international negotiations. As I mentioned, they host a massive U.S. military base that they pay a good deal of money to kind of help create and support. In terms of other things in sports, they're the first country in the region that hosted the last World Cup in 2024, which was a big deal. And kind of on a humorous side, but pushback side, this is kind of like the Onion, the Pan-Arab Inquirer, but saying like Qatar to buy Amnesty International. So they've certainly faced pushback on some human rights violations with the construction of World Cup stadiums, but beyond just kind of more tongue-in-cheek stuff. There was a period that some of you may remember when they were facing a massive boycott and a cutting in ties and a lack of normalization with other Arab states. So sometimes and today we're focused on Arab-Israeli normalization, but it doesn't mean that other Arab and Muslim majority states in the region all have normalized relations either. So for example, like take Algeria and Morocco, who have very fraught ties, or Iran and Saudi, as we'll talk about, who have historically had some fraught ties, or in this case, the Qataris and a bunch of states listed here, all of these who cut ties with Qatar or downgraded ties or otherwise. What does this come out of? A couple of things. One, it comes out of Al Jazeera and Al Jazeera's coverage of the Arab Spring or various domestic uprisings, where some of these states feel like Al Jazeera, which again is privately owned, but the Qataris certainly have a lot of sway in some of the coverage, that it was critical of some of these governments. So those governments that sometimes have shuttered Al Jazeera offices or, again, pushed back against the Qataris, and or the Qataris have supported various Islamist political groups and armed groups in a variety of these different countries that these countries have not liked. So long and short, there was a period of a couple of years where the Qataris were facing a blockade and a cutting of ties with a lot of their neighbors, which again is very important. If you look at Qatar's geography, they're basically surrounded by the Saudis, the Bahrainis are there, the United Arab Emirates are there. So to have those three countries boycott them, basically their only other outlet is right across here with Iran. So there was some argument that this pushed them more into the arms of Iran, but again, the Qataris hold themselves up to be this key kind of bridge country that has relations with everybody, and ultimately these relations were mostly restored, but there was a period not that long ago when they were not. Now, what about other countries in terms of expansion of the Abraham Accords? Another thing the Trump administration is pushing right now is with Indonesia. You may have seen some recent meetings where you had the Indonesian president alongside Trump, having some warm exchanges. Indonesia has actually pledged, as mentioned here in this article, 20,000 peacekeepers to the International Stabilization Force, Security Force in Gaza. Again, those troops have not materialized yet. In fact, none have. But there have been some key things that have happened. The U.S. and Trump administration was able to get a UN Security Council resolution that passed, giving a UN mandate to the ISF in Gaza, which is a big deal. And it was a key condition that Indonesia said they did not want to be seen as, nor be some kind of foreign occupying force that doesn't have an international mandate. So they now have the UN mandate. That being said, there's still a great deal of uncertainty with the ISF in terms of what's its actual mandate going to be? What is it kind of, operations and rules of engagement going to be? Is that force supposed to be disarming Hamas? Not just Indonesia, but other states have basically blanched at the idea that they're going to do anything other than peacekeeping. So if they have to do peace enforcement or disarm Hamas, I don't think you're going to get these states to want to send their troops. But if that happens or you have some broader deal, Indonesia has signaled they're willing to send some troops. This is certainly a shift from going back to Sukarno or other leaders in Indonesia who have much more strong solidarity with the Palestinians, said we're not going to normalize relations with Israel. That being said, the current president of Indonesia has said, okay, yes, we're willing to send some of these troops, but we will recognize Israel only if there is Palestinian statehood, and Israel saying we support kind of Palestinian statehood. So, similar to the Saudis, Indonesia has shifted a bit from full solidarity with the Palestinians, we will not recognize Israel, it has to be 60, all these things, to now being like, okay, we'll send some troops to Gaza. We will potentially recognize Israel, but still holding this connection to Palestinian statehood and Israeli support for it as the key concession that at least publicly they're saying they need before Indonesia can make that move. What about other countries that are currently in the Abraham Accords? Take the UAE, going back to this discussion of like warm peace, cold peace. Of the different Arab states that have peace with the Israelis, you could argue the UAE has been the warmest peace in the sense that not just in terms of investment or travel, but also in terms of things like museums in the UAE, where you had exhibits on like the history of the Jewish people in the region or things like that on a cultural level. The UAE has probably had the warmest peace with the Israelis over the past 5 years, but even they have said, we back the peace efforts the Trump administration is pushing. We'll potentially provide aid, but we do not want to be involved at the moment in the stabilization force. Again, we don't see a clear mandate for it. We're concerned about what it's going to lead to vis-a-vis Hamas or the Israelis or what the length of it's going to be. So again, one of the biggest supporters vis-a-vis the Abraham Accords in Israel, the UAE, has at least to this point said we're not going to send troops into Gaza. And then finally, kind of circling back to the Egyptians, who again have full diplomatic relations for the longest of any Arab state with Israel, going back to, 78, 79, 80. Sisi, the president of Egypt, has not met with the Israelis since October 7th. And one of the things that's come up in the news recently, you can see this just from yesterday, is that the Trump administration is kind of pushing for a summit between Sisi and Netanyahu. But to even make that happen, it seems like what Sisi and others are asking for is there's this gas deal with Cairo and the Israelis that has been stalled, and so he wants Netanyahu and the Israelis to kind of push that forward. There need to be some economic incentives here, and again, this is just to get a meeting between states that have normalized relations. So again, going to what the past 2 years have done and what the death and destruction in Gaza has done from the perspective of Arab states, their relations with the Israelis, there are real costs to meeting and shaking hands with Netanyahu right now that Sisi is wary of. And so going to the challenges to the Abraham Accords or to just countries that are part of normalized relations, the past 2 years in the present situation still pose a lot of stumbling blocks. Yes, there has been an exchange of hostages and prisoners and detainees, but the second phase of the deal has not yet been achieved yet. There hasn't been close to full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. There has not been Hamas disarmament or a new government in Gaza. So even states that have normalized relations with the Israelis are still pretty wary today. Okay, so I'll pause there. I'll take questions, particularly on the stuff I just talked about current challenges to the Abraham Accords, either in terms of backsliding or in terms of new countries that could potentially join. I'll answer some of those questions, and then we'll go to some of the future for Arab-Israeli relations to the region, starting by focusing on the Trump administration's national security strategy, what it means for the broader Middle East, and then a couple of other issues. So let me go to the Q&A. Please add any questions that you have, particularly about this most recent section, but I'll also maybe go back and answer others if I didn't get to them. Okay. Which Arab nations would accept a two-state solution that does not include unlimited Palestinian right of return? Okay, good question. So it depends on, I'm gonna take it two ways. If you mean unlimited Palestinian right of return to present-day Israel, which again is a very high bar that I don't think the Israelis would ever agree to, I don't think that that's the standard that most Arab states will require. I think that, again, the basics of the Clinton parameters, the negotiations are under Oslo, where you would get a Palestinian state in all of Gaza, most 90, 95% plus of the West Bank, some parts of East Jerusalem, and then maybe land swaps for some of the settlement blocks that would remain part of Israel in the southern West Bank or northern West Bank or parts of Gaza. I think the vast majority of Arab states would sign up for that, and then the right of return would be practiced in a couple of ways. One is the ability to go to this nascent Palestinian state, even if it's not back to your original homes in present-day Israel, it's to a Palestinian state. alongside citizenship being offered by some of the Arab states to some of those refugee population, some compensation being paid, and maybe, again, this would be a sticking point, but maybe some degree of recognition from the Israelis of their role in the creation of the refugee issue. I don't think there's too many Arab states that are like, the only way I will accept normalization with the Israelis is the full Palestinian right of return to their original homes needs to be arrived at. Because, again, to be honest, I don't see the Israeli government ever agreeing to that. And so, if any of these Arab states are signaling that we want to normalize with the Israelis, I don't think they would do so to this extent that some of them have, if that was their requirement. So, I think right of return, it depends on how that would actually be carried out in practice. I think there's a version of it that Arab states would sign on to, but that the Israelis never would. But I do think there's a possible bargaining range there, where Palestinians would be able to practice that in some form, but not in its full form that Arab states would agree to. And maybe this current Israeli government wouldn't agree to, but maybe future governments would. Okay, do I think the ISF is beneficial for Israel? I heard that it is unlikely to take any action against Hamas and will likely get in the way of Israel taking out Hamas terrorists, and worse, could end up with some ISF casualties that they blame on Israel. Okay, so in terms of the ISF and what it can and can't do or will or will not do, a lot of that is being hashed out now, and people are asking some of the exact same questions you're asking, which is, what are these forces going to actually do? What are they going to have the authority to do and not do? How long are they going to stay there? What countries they're coming from? I mentioned the Indonesians. Another key point is the Turks have said, we want to be part of the ISF. And the Israelis, more than any of the other countries, have said, we do not want the Turks to be there as part of it, right? Because Turkish-Israeli relations are kind of at a nadir at some point right now. But the Turks, nonetheless, are a key regional player. They're a NATO ally. The Trump administration has been somewhat supportive of Erdogan and the Turks being involved. So in that broad sense, who's going to be part of it is key. But going to your question, look, I think that if Hamas is not disarmed, that goes against a lot of the ceasefire deal, which, to be clear, is consensus among many states, right? Whether it's not just the Americans and the Israelis, the Arab states have said, we want Hamas to be disarmed. European states have said this, right? Of course, the key actor who said they don't want this is Hamas. And so it's not that the Israelis haven't been trying to destroy Hamas or disarm Hamas over the past 2 years of, very intensive, shelling and invasion and otherwise. So the question is, why would a peacekeeping force of states that are going to use less aggressive tactics and be there for less long and otherwise going to disarm Hamas when, the Israeli state could not do so? It's tough for me to envision how that's going to happen absent Hamas agreeing to it. Now, is there some possibility of like Hamas saying, okay, we'll give up, rockets or some things like that, but we need to keep small arms to kind of like keep peace and stability or whatever inside of our part of Gaza? Like, that wouldn't be full disarmament for sure, but could I see some type of deal like that happening, even if each side tries to cheat on it a little bit? I could see that as possible. But I do not see it as very likely that you're either going to get Arab and Muslim majority states to sign up for sending their troops into Gaza to actively disarm Hamas if Hamas is unwilling to do so, nor do I think if they did agree to that, that they would easily be able to do so. So I think that you're not wrong to say, is Hamas likely going to fully disarm? Probably correct to bet against that happening. And then what actually happens in the broader context of, what does this force do? Again, peacekeeping forces, whether in Eastern Europe or elsewhere, definitely sometimes do face pushback and do face, violence and sometimes death. And that can lead to very sticky diplomatic situations. So it's not that the ISF doesn't have international mandate. They do have the mandate from the UN. It's not that I can't foresee a way in which they act as a stabilizing presence, maybe in the areas that Israel currently controls that it will back off from or otherwise, and there'll be a mix like Hamas controlled and non-Hamas but non-Israel controlled zones, something like that. But yeah, you put your finger directly on the key challenge today, if that makes sense. Okay, next questions. QME is a U.S. law, not just diplomatic commitment. My understanding is that even if Qatar Saudi got F-35s, they would be inferior. Okay, yeah. So again, sometimes I'm using just different terms here in terms of whether it's a law passed by Congress or a commitment or otherwise. But your second point isn't wrong that F-35s, it's not like they're all the same. There can be different types of software or hardware that's put in them that could be a way to kind of square the circle of having stronger, basically platforms for the Israelis than for Arab states. So, take the point. Every credible expert is calling what Israel is doing in Gaza genocide, and surveys show that 80% of Israelis support this. How does this affect the willingness of Israel to compromise versus continue to expand greater Israel? Okay, so just a couple points on that. You're not wrong that there are definitely some international experts and or international bodies that define Israel's actions in Gaza as genocide, something that's again up at the ICJ right now. I have not seen any polls that 80% of Israelis believe in the situation in Gaza genocide. I would disagree that that's the percentage there, although there are some Israeli organizations, individuals who have said this. So I just disagree on the percentage. How does this determination, one way or another, affect the willingness of Israel to compromise versus continue to expand greater Israel? Okay, it's an interesting question. Um, the Israelis are the most powerful party here, right? They're the most powerful economic and diplomatic party, certainly vis-a-vis the Palestinians, but even vis-a-vis the Arab states. And so a lot of what's going to happen next, is there going to be a deal with Arab states? Is there going to be a Palestinian state? A lot of that hinges on Israeli foreign policy, which is why the 2026 elections coming up in Israel, whether it's going to be a continuation of Netanyahu's reign as the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, or there's going to be kind of the anti-Netanyahu coalition, which, to be clear, is not some left-wing coalition. It's actually a lot of folks on the right, some folks on the center, some folks on the left, maybe some Arab parties, but they may be more willing to compromise and or less supportive of the idea of like greater Israel, of annexing the West Bank or having Israeli troops stationed in Syria otherwise, though again, not all of those things would someone like Naftali Bennett push back on. So going to your question to sum up, I do think that I don't know how much the situation in Gaza and how it's labeled impacts the determination of whether Israel will want to compromise or push towards greater Israel. But I do think that there's some correlation here between which parties and actors in Israel see the situation in Gaza as having gone too far versus not far enough. How aggressive should Israel be vis-a-vis Lebanon and Hezbollah or Syria? I think there are some differences of opinion there. I think most Israelis, center, left, and right, see Iran as a major threat and are generally okay with aggressive policy vis-a-vis Iran, although there's some difference of opinion on this stuff. But I do think how you deal with the Palestinians and the Americans and Arab states, that is a foreign policy issue on which kind of the Israeli right versus the center and left do have disagreements. And so the election in 2026 will have an impact there. How much of the posturing at the moment on every side is a function of the perception of whether U.S. foreign policy will survive behind the current Trump administration? Excellent question. We're going to talk about this in just a moment, but let's give a quick preview here. And it's not even just beyond the Trump administration, it's also in the current Trump administration, right? There are still debates among Israelis and Arab states and others of how serious is the Trump administration, right? One of the things I left off with on one of my last talks was this ceasefire can keep moving forward. It's no guarantee that it will, but it can, as long as the Trump administration is going to keep pressuring the Israelis, the Arab states, the Hamas through the Arab states, etc., to push forward on phase two. The second the Trump administration focuses on other things or isn't willing to pressure these parties or isn't willing to make diplomatic concessions to help make these deals happen, the deal's going to fall apart. The Netanyahu administration does not want to draw any more from Gaza. They want to potentially restart trying to degrade Hamas. Hamas does not want to disarm. They do not want to be pushed out of power. Like, again, the key parties here do not want to keep moving on this stuff. They can be convinced to move on this stuff if the other side moves some and or they face massive pressure from their backers. But absent U.S. pressure, it's going to fall apart. So you're 100% correct to suggest that whether the Trump administration will remain committed to this ceasefire deal and broader regional normalization and or whoever comes next from the U.S. election, whether it's, J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio, someone on the Republican side, or, Gavin Newsom or AOC or whoever on the Democratic side, no guarantee at all that those individuals will be as committed to pushing regional normalization forward or resolving the Arab-Israeli or Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. So yes, is there hedging here by parties about what's the time horizon? How certain can I be about this stuff? 100%. Because no one wants to commit troops to Gaza and then feel like the Americans are going to not care about or want them to pull back, and not actually fulfill the mission. No Arab states want to invest billions of dollars in rebuilding Gaza if they're not certain that it's not going to result in more conflict between Hamas and Israelis the next month, the next year, or whatever. So time horizons here and how much these countries can rely on American presidents and diplomatic pressure is huge in terms of whether this stuff is going to go forward. Okay, I'll do a couple more questions now, and then we'll go to another section. We'll do some more questions. Okay, scrolling up here because I missed some here at the beginning. What is the present status of UN Resolution 242 Land for Peace concept? Does it still apply? Yeah, it still applies. Now, do you get, Hamas referencing Resolution 242 too often or the Israelis too much? Not too often, but do you see the Americans sometimes for sure, and certainly some of the Arab and European states referencing UN Resolution 242? 100%. This is the basis in many ways for things like, the New York Declaration by the French and the Saudis and others, basically saying that this is what we're asking for: land for peace Israel pulls back from this land in whole or in part. These surrounding states, make peace and normalize with the Israelis. So that's still the formula, explicitly or implicitly, for most two-state kind of solution people. It's just whether the two-state solution is still plausible or whether various parties actually want it, whether among Palestinians, Israelis, or others, is a much more open question, especially after the failure of the Oslo process over the past couple of decades. Can I comment on how the largest Muslim majority country, Indonesia, fits into the Arab-Israeli conflict? I don't know if you might have put that before I brought up Indonesia there, so I think I partially answered that. But in terms of how they might matter, certainly being the largest Muslim country in terms of their population matters in terms of Muslim majority sense. Because if you talk about identities at the core of this conflict, Palestinian identity, Arab identity, Muslim identity, Christian, I mean, all of these religious and ethnic identities can play a role here in the solidarity that states have for different people, in if they see their holy sites or things like that are being damaged or being held by others, or you're not getting access to as pilgrims or visitors. That stuff all matters. So if Indonesia normalized with the Israelis, I would not react to it the way I'm reacting to the Kazakhstan situation, where it's like, okay, this is kind of a peripheral country that already had relations with the Israelis, no biggie at all. Indonesia does not have normalized relations with the Israelis, is a much larger Muslim majority country with more kind of diplomatic clout in many ways. And it's, kind of a linchpin to South Asia, whether it's with Malaysia or other countries, like that could have an impact. So Indonesia normalizing the Israelis wouldn't be meaningless, especially for a country like Saudi Arabia or Iran, who like hold themselves up to be the leader of the Muslim world. That being said, Indonesia is halfway around the world. It's not an Arab Muslim country. So, it wouldn't be something that the Indonesians did that and then the Saudis and others would be like, oh, we better get in the game because otherwise we'll lose out leadership of the Arab and Muslim world to Indonesia. And again, Indonesia is nowhere close to, nor has ever been on the border of fighting an armed conflict with the Israelis one way or another. So it would be more than Kazakhstan, but much less even than like, the UAE and Bahrain in the eyes of many Arab countries, if that makes sense. But it wouldn't be meaningless. Okay, a couple of other points here, and then I'll go back to some more discussion. Regarding the Palestinian students you spoke with who feel betrayed by the Arab states, do any of them say they would accept the 2000 or up to 2008 two-state solution, or is that not a consideration? Okay, so the answer is yes, some of them do. I would point to a couple of things. So first, let's go broadly. If you want to see polls on Palestinian state support for the two-state solution, there's tons of them. And you can look at them over time and you can see, honestly, the decline in support for it over time or belief in it over time. Again, there's no better person than Khalil Shikaki and the PCPSR, or you can look at the Arab Barometer. They survey not just Palestinians, but other countries in the region over time about, do you support or believe in the idea of a two-state solution? In fact, and let me go to my slides for a second. I think I got one of these in my reserves here. Yes, I do. So in terms of, sorry, I'm just bringing this back up here. Okay. In terms of other states in the region and whether they support the idea of a two-state solution, let me bring up a slide here that kind of gets to this stuff. There we go. Okay, so to be clear, this is the wave of 2023 to 2024. So some of these are asked before October 7th, some are asked after. But when people in the region are asked, what is your preferred solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the two-state solution on 67 borders gets plurality support, if not majority support, in pretty much all these countries, right? Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Mauritania, Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia, it gets more support than any of the other solutions. And again, Palestinians aren't listed here, but the Arab Barometer does include Palestinians, and PCPSR is focused on Palestinians. So you can find in various time periods either a majority of Palestinians supporting a two-state solution or a plurality. Now, what's happened over the past couple of decades, kind of in a mirror image of Israeli society and Palestinian society, is you have a decrease in support or especially belief in the two-state solution, right? And it's kind of a mirrored story. Both Palestinians and Israelis feel like we gave these concessions, we took these painful steps, we got nothing in return from the other side. We got violence from them, we got betrayed promises, and to be clear, both the Israeli government and the Palestinian leadership have done things that are against what they agreed to in the Oslo Accord, so there's been violations by both. But both of those populations feel like we made concessions. We didn't get what we were promised. We don't trust the other side, especially since October 7th in Gaza. We don't trust the other side. We have a lot of hatred for the other side among many. We feel like they're unjust, that they don't value our lives, that we could never, reconcile with them. So yeah, in terms of support for a two-state solution, if you ask people if a two-state solution happened under these parameters and it really worked, can you still get plurality or even majority Israeli-Palestinian support? Yes. But there's been just a huge decline in the belief that a two-state solution can happen among both Palestinians and Israelis. So going to your question, I meet Palestinians all the time who are supportive of the idea of a two-state solution, but they're very hesitant of whether it's possible to have happen. And also, to be fair, I interact with a lot of Palestinians and a lot of Israelis, but there is some selection effect there. The Palestinians that are in many of the organizations that I'm part of are generally not like strong Hamas supporters or people who support, destroying the state of Israel, which exists for some Palestinians, but are generally not going to be the Palestinians that join organizations that are very proud Palestinians, but nonetheless are willing to interact with Israelis and try to push towards some kind of broader resolution that usually would be two-state or a confederation or otherwise. Okay, let me answer one more question and then I'll get into this next section. Then we'll do some kind of more Q&A here. What are the chances that the Chinese fill the gap if Americans, it says easy focus on MENA, I presume like lose focus on MENA or something, a la the Saudi-Iran deal. Let's talk about that in just a moment. I'm going to bring that up momentarily, but China right now is not pushing to fill kind of like the security military gap the US would leave if they left the region, but China is becoming more and more of an economic investor in the region and a state that kind of sells itself as saying, look, unlike the Americans historically, we'll invest with you, we'll help kind of your, regional power, but we won't criticize you over your human rights record or kind of things like this, like maybe the Americans have. So let's keep talking a bit about that and go kind of that exact issue because I've got some slides and some points related to that. Okay, so future of international relations in the region. I'll talk about China in just a moment here, but let's start with something that just came out in the past couple of days, which is the national security strategy of the United States, which is, of course, the Trump administration strategy. So right off the bat, you can see some of the tension playing out that I mentioned in the first talk on Trump's grand strategy, where, at least rhetorically, it seems like the quote unquote restrainers have won in the Trump administration. Because as I'll go through in a minute with the language, so much of the national security strategy is like, the Middle East is not where the US is going to be focused going forward. Here's the reasons why, etc. So Trump in some states, and again, it's not just the national security strategy. He's given prior speeches over the past couple of years saying the era of nation building by the US in the Middle East, North Africa is over. The era of the US meddling in the affairs of the Middle East is over. Forever wars are over, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. So that's what the rhetoric is, and that's been pretty consistent, and that's encapsulated in this new document that the White House just issued. But in terms of actions, Trump is chairing the Board of Peace for Gaza, which is supposedly going to be controlling and dictating what's going on in Gaza for the next, significant period of time. There's U.S. military advisors in Israel in ways that there weren't before that are overseeing the ceasefire. The Trump administration is actively pushing for not just disarming Hamas, but also Hezbollah, and is very involved in internal Lebanese politics right now. The US just gave Qatar some security guarantees, which again, if they're not just rhetorical, it means if Qatar is striked or threatened, the US would be coming to Qatar's aid. That's what security guarantees are. Saudi Arabia has just been upgraded to a major non-NATO ally status, selling them potentially, higher level arms as well as potentially security guarantees and any later deals. The US just launched an unprecedented strike over the summer on Iran's nuclear program, and Trump has said that the US will do it again if Iran kind of keeps building a nuclear arms program. The US has lessened sanctions on Syria and has been supporting a regime transition in Syria. The US has said in the same document that the key thing is rivalry vis-a-vis China and balancing against China. Well, as the questioner just asked, China is getting more and more involved in the Middle East. So clearly the Middle East could be a key battleground for influence vis-a-vis China, not fully dissimilar from prior Cold War vis-a-vis the Soviets. So the Trump administration is putting its feet in something that is not unprecedented, which is when the George W. Bush administration came to office, they said this era of nation building is over, and then soon got involved in multiple wars in the Middle East and multiple nation building projects. Clinton said similar things, got very involved. Obama said similar things. I'm going to pull out of Iraq, but then gets more involved in Afghanistan. The history of US presidents, whether it's on the right, the left, whatever, has been for decades now, we're going to want to get out of the Middle East or move out of the Middle East, and then events conspire, and the US is right in the Middle East as it was before, if not more involved than it was. So I don't doubt the fact that many of Trump's advisors, and maybe Trump himself, sees himself as like, America first, get the US out of the region. These are costly forever wars, etc. But they're keeping interests the US cares about, right? Whether it's Israel's security and normalization, whether it's stuff vis-a-vis Iran, whether it's stuff vis-a-vis China, like there still are many, many, many reasons that the US will remain involved in the Middle East for their foreseeable future, whatever policy is laid out in terms of restraint or making some changes on the margins. We'll see whether the rubber actually hits the road on some of these statements. But let's go to China for a little bit and then some to the exact text, right? So going to the point that one of the questioners just raised, this kind of, again, a form of normalization between Iran and Saudi after years of fighting proxy wars in Iraq, in Yemen, etc. You had in 2023 this kind of, pushing towards greater normalization with the Saudis and the Iranians. Again, in the middle, it's not President Biden or President Trump or previously President Clinton or President Carter. It's a Chinese official that's kind of being brought in to some extent by the Saudis as shepherding this through, which was not unintentional. And the Saudis knew what this would feel like to the Americans, the sense of kind of like, we've got other options, right? If you are doing things that we don't like, pressuring us on stuff with our actions in the neighborhood or human rights or whatever, like there's other partners here that we can work with, most notably the Chinese. And by the way, it's not just the Gulf countries. Egypt has had increased military alignment with China because of, in part, the fact that the Americans say we are going to guarantee a qualitative military edge to the Israelis. Well, guess what? The Chinese have no problem selling the Egyptians many, many things. And so the Egyptians have brought from the Chinese some higher level fighters. You can actually see a joint military exercise over the pyramids and the Sphinx with the Egyptians and the Chinese. And so Egypt remains a U.S. ally and, again, a normalized country in terms of relations with Israel. But increasingly, there has been a weakening of ties with the Egyptians and the Israelis, some concern with Sisi and the Egyptians about America's role, growing Chinese investment and support. So, interesting thing to keep an eye on there. Okay, let's go to the national security strategy, which just came out, a week or two ago, and you can again find the full text of this online. It's not that long of a document. It's actually written in pretty plain language. There's a lot of stuff to understand behind it, but I just want to go quickly to the portion on the Middle East, which is again our key focus here. So page 27. So again, not the very first thing, although there's some primer up above, but page 27 is where Trump administration starts to talk about the Middle East. Let's go through a couple key points here, right? For a half century at least, American foreign policy has prioritized the Middle East above all other regions. So basically saying that past 50 years plus, the Middle East has been the number one region the U.S. has been involved in, but for a couple of reasons that doesn't need to happen going forward. So this is like classic restrainer rhetoric of like, okay, the U.S. has always been involved in the Middle East, but kind of implying to its detriment or not being the best idea. But now, again, they're trying to thread a needle here saying, it's not that the Middle East is not important anymore. It's just that there's a couple reasons why the U.S. does not have to be as forward deployed as it's been. One is energy supplies. For a long time, the U.S. has been involved in the Middle East, as I mentioned in the first talk, to have free flow of oil from the region. But now the U.S. is like the number one oil in terms of how much it's pulling and creating in millions of barrels each day, as well as the fact that, guess what? With fracking in other countries, with deployments from elsewhere, you don't have to really protect all of these areas and worry about this as much as before. Now, interestingly, later in the document, it talks about, well, you have to ensure security in the Strait of Hormuz and other things. So they're still kind of talking about free flow of oil, but they're just saying that diversity of energy makes the Middle East less important. The other thing is basically saying, look, there's been all this conflict in the Middle East, but now that era is kind of over, right? So whether it was Arab-Israeli conflict historically, as we talked about, or more recently, stuff in Yemen or with Gaza or otherwise, Trump administration is saying that is now changing with all the initiative the Trump administration has done. Of the two, to me, that's the much more questionable position. I don't think it's deniable that energy supplies have diversified and Middle East oil, though it still matters because of how cheap it is to get out and how many reserves there are there. Middle East still matters a lot for international oil, but less than it did. But this second point about now the Middle East is entering this kind of more peaceful, stable era, I think there's points to that, but I think that is far from guaranteed. So as you kind of see, if you keep going in the document, Middle East partners are demonstrating their commitment to combating radicalism. Doing so drops America's misguided experiment with hectoring these nations into abandoning their traditions. America will always have core interests of Gulf energy supplies at heart. So a couple key things here, basically saying like the Gulf and the Middle East can be this new center of investment in AI and nuclear energy and these things. These countries are combating radicalism. These are just basically saying things like what the Saudis are doing with Vision 2030, other states basically countering what the Trump administration is categorizing as like more extreme views, either vis-a-vis the West or vis-a-vis religion or otherwise, but then also saying, well, what America is going to do in response is we're not going to hector you on democratizing. So basically saying that the Saudi model is the model that the Trump administration supports. You go after some of your extremists, ideologically and domestically, and we will not criticize you for human rights violations or lack of liberal democracy, etc. And that'll be kind of the deal. To be fair, that's not unprecedented. A number of prior US presidents who supported whether it was the Saudis or the Iranians under the Shah had a version of this deal of like, you tamp down on anti-American or more extremist ideological forces. In exchange, we'll support, guarantee your regime security, and we're not going to criticize you domestically. Now, some presidents, like President Jimmy Carter, switched that and started to criticize Iran. But again, that's one of the reasons there was pushback on whether that helped to cause the Iranian Revolution, or again, we're getting off the beaten path here. Final point, and this is what the Trump administration wraps up the national security strategy on the Middle East saying. In the days in which the Middle East dominated American foreign policy, those are thankfully over. Not because the Middle East no longer matters, but because it no longer the constant irritant and potential source of imminent catastrophe that it once was. It is emerging as a place of partnership, friendship, and investment, a trend that should be welcomed and encouraged. In fact, President Trump's ability to unite the Arab world at Sharm el-Sheikh in pursuit of peace and normalization will allow the United States to finally prioritize American interest. This to me is aspirational. It's not that there aren't steps that are along these lines, but if this vision that the Trump administration is selling here is reality, then whether you like or dislike Trump, he should be in line for a Nobel Peace Prize. Because if the Middle East is now going to be a place where you're not going to have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, Saudi-Iranian rivalry, all of the domestic challenges that are going on inside Lebanon with Hezbollah, with Iraq, and building a country there that's stable and prosperous, if these things are no longer going to be issues, and now it's going to be a region of normalized relations, investments that work out, a lack of regional wars, like, great. I think everyone on this call would welcome that, regardless of your political ideologies and preferences. It's just, I think this is, again, much more aspirational than reality. I mean, we've already just talked about all of the challenges with stabilizing Gaza and dealing with Israel, Hamas, the ISF, etc., let alone issues with China in the region or Iranian and Saudi rivalry, which is dissipated but isn't necessarily going to go away, alongside the rebuilding of Iran's maybe axis of resistance. What happens with Hezbollah? Again, it's not like this is impossible, and it's not like this is something I personally would not like to happen, but many presidents have come into office before being like, this time is different. The region's going to be peaceful and stable, and that's why we can withdraw, and then events have overtaken them. Now, it doesn't mean that the Trump administration couldn't have a different tact and say, guess what? There's going to continue to be significant conflict and strife in the region, but it's not our conflict, and we're going to get out of it, even if it does lead to more destabilization. That, to me, is a more defensible position in terms of reality, which is to say, hey, U.S. interests are not served by getting involved in forever wars or these things that don't turn out the way the U.S. wants. So even though the U.S. pulling back means there's going to be continued instability, maybe even more in the near term, but that's not the U.S. problem. That to me would be more in line with kind of some of the things that Trump has said on restraint or America first or whatever. But the vision of the U.S. can pull back now because now the Middle East is stable and peaceful, I'm hopeful, but I'm skeptical. Okay, a couple final points I wanted to raise that I haven't heard people say as much before, and I would love your feedback on, and then we'll go to a final group of questions. So one is on the Israeli side, which is we've talked a lot about the Arab states and their challenges and their concerns, but I want to talk a little bit about Israel and some of the domestic issues in Israel that have an impact here. So if you follow Israeli politics, you know, so we had a previous questioner about how Palestinians feel about a two-state solution. Let's go to the Israeli side. You had during Oslo majority of Israelis who supported the idea of a two-state solution, even though it was never like 80%. It was often in like low to mid 50s, etc. And again, look at like Jacob Shamir, Dalia Shenlin, or other great Israeli scholars and pollsters on some of this stuff. But that's declined significantly, right? There's been a lot of great studies on like the decline of like basically the peace camp in Israel, or at least people who believe in the reality and possibility of this. And then certainly you have politicians like Netanyahu, or certainly folks like Smotrich or Ben-Gvir, who have said, I've always been against a Palestinian state. And Netanyahu has come out recently and said, I'm one of the reasons we don't have a Palestinian state, and you Israeli voters should thank me for recognizing, the trap of Oslo and the downfall of Oslo. And also, by the way, the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 was a mistake, and that helped to lead to October 7th, etc. So this is one of the things that, again, you'll hear this in the 2026 Israeli elections. One of the things I want to put forward that I don't think I've seen too much, but I think is an important thing to understand in the context of normalization in the region, is that you have this. Sometimes in Israel, you see this debate over like two state versus, one state, or greater Israel versus, different approaches. And it's kind of talked about like only one is being pursued and only one is possible. I think an important thing to understand for Israelis, especially over the past decade or so and going forward, is that Israel has kind of had this mixed situation that is, you could argue, has uniquely benefited Israel. And it's the following. Israel has lived and controlled a one state reality where, whatever your preferences are, pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, in between, however you define those things, whatever, there's only one state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea today, right? There's just Israel. And then we have the West Bank and Gaza, which Israel has varying degrees of control, but not annexation. But there's also not a Palestinian state there, right? So it's a one state reality, has been for a while. But at the same time, Israel under various leaderships, whether it was Yitzhak Rabin or Ehud Olmert or Ehud Barak or even Netanyahu at various points, have been negotiating seemingly towards a two-state solution. So to me, in terms of diplomacy, that has actually benefited the Israelis of they've had more of a one-state reality in terms of control, but they've had more of a two-state negotiation internationally that has helped nudge along greater normalization with Israel or greater support from countries in Europe or the US that they would otherwise get. One of the questions that the Israelis face, and I don't think I've seen Netanyahu really talk or face up to this, is if the next Israeli government is the same as this current one, with maybe some changes on the fringe, where it's a pretty right-wing government that's quite opposed to Palestinian statehood, you're going to see an increasing of the trends you've seen the past couple of years, which is a belief that not only is the two-state solution maybe difficult to achieve, but now the Israeli government and the Israeli people are basically committed to it not happening. And again, you can get into all the reasons why, because there's distrust with Hamas, because of October 7th, et cetera. Like whatever the reason is, leave that aside. If you have an Israeli government that is openly saying there will be no two-state solution, we will not work towards a two-state solution, etc., then actually some of the benefits that Israel has gotten over the past couple of decades that even Netanyahu's government has benefited from is going to potentially go away. And we're really going to see a test of, okay, can Netanyahu's vision of you don't have to have a Palestinian state, but you can still get normalization with Arab states because of their interests of having, intelligence and security cooperation with the Israelis vis-a-vis Iran, because these Arab states, even though they say they care about the Palestinians, they actually don't really care about them and they're willing to make a deal. There's going to be a real test of that if you have Netanyahu's government in power again. Because for a while now, and again, it's been less and less, but for the past couple decades, you've had one state reality, but two state negotiation, and Israel getting more normalization because of those two state negotiations. Whether you want to call those a fig leaf or otherwise, that's up to you. But Israel has a key choice to make on foreign policy. And this is going to be simultaneously like the post-October 7th election, which both has a lot of Israelis with a lack of trust and animosity vis-a-vis the Palestinians, also some lack of trust and animosity vis-a-vis their government, but then also, Netanyahu with some support for operations against Iran or against Hezbollah or things like that. So it will be very interesting to see how the Israeli 2026 election plays out, because for a while now, the key issues in Israeli politics have been domestic ones. The Palestinian issue was like fifth or sixth or seventh, but this election, 2026, somewhat uniquely, foreign policy is going to play a key role. Yes, things like the draft for the ultra-Orthodox is going to matter and economic issues are going to matter, but foreign policy is really going to matter. And this kind of one state, two state normalization, relations with Arab states and the broader world is going to be key. And is it going to be like Netanyahu's vision of like the neo-Sparta that's going to have to kind of go it alone more, but Israel can be strong and eventually is going to draw countries to it for their strength? Or is it going to be this alternative kind of like two-state negotiation vision of you can still have kind of a strong Israel, but willingness to work towards a Palestinian state to get broader regional normalization? Like, is that the way to go? And there's going to be fights not just between those two visions, but different versions of them. And so I think it's important to kind of think about that. And I welcome people's questions and comments on that. Okay, so We've got about 5 minutes left. I'll go to some final questions here. I look forward to those on the stuff I just talked about for the future, on Israeli politics, on the national security strategy, these types of things, or anything else you'd like to ask about. Let me go to the Q&A again. Okay. Thank you. This was great. Thank you. It's been great having you. You've talked about the possibility that Netanyahu's coalition wins in 2026 or the opposition wins. What about a third possibility that Likud gets a large enough majority that the extreme right-wing parties no longer have the leverage they currently have? How would that affect the Israeli-Palestinian situation? Okay, excellent question, right? Sometimes you ask questions that I just don't have time to go through every scenario, but you ask one that's an important one. So it's correct to say, for those who don't know, it's not really a left versus right fight inside of Israel today for domestic politics. It's a pro and anti-Netanyahu coalition fight. And it's been going on through multiple elections inside of Israel. Again, what this questioner is bringing up correctly is that it may just be those same old parties kind of fighting it out. But as you know, if you follow Israeli politics, it's not a two-party system. It's like an eight-party system, depending on how you count it. And some parties will rise and disappear, and some will fall, and some will maybe shift a little bit. So yes, there is a possibility that if, like, say, Smotrich's party falls off the map, kind of a more far right party, and then Netanyahu looks around and is like, okay, I can't really form a coalition with just the ultra Orthodox parties and the far right parties like Jewish Power or otherwise, but I could form a coalition that's kind of like a center right coalition where I make some concessions on stuff with the Palestinians or on the draft with the ultra Orthodox, and then I get more of these like Avigdor Lieberman's party or Bennett's party or others, and maybe even some centrist parties and left wing parties even, and I make kind of like a unity coalition. That's definitely a possibility, and it's certainly something that the Trump administration and the Americans and the Europeans and many would like really support and say, okay, this is how you both get progress on the Arab normalization and Palestinian fronts, where also you get legitimacy and support from Europeans and some Americans who have been very critical of Netanyahu's kind of far right coalition. So, is that possible? Yes. And by the way, excuse me, if it happened, go back to who has made peace and signed these normalization deals on the Israeli side. Yitzhak Rabin signed the deal with Jordan and signed the deal with the Palestinians. But Egypt was signed with Menachem Begin, from Herut, the predecessor to Netanyahu and Likud. The Abraham Accords were signed with Netanyahu. So at least in terms of numbers, you have more normalization deals signed with members, leadership from the Israeli right than the Israeli left, even though we classically think, well, the left is the one more willing to make compromise and make a deal, the right less so. And there may be some truth to that, but it's also important to note, what does the Israeli right bring? It brings the fact that if Netanyahu says, let's make this deal, the deal will happen, because the right has been the one that's most hesitant to do so. And so if you get a leader that has some support on the right or in the security establishment to then say, make the deal, you'll get the left and you'll get the center, but you also get some of them and you make it happen. To some extent, that's what Rabin had as well. Even though Rabin was a man of the left in the sense of being part of labor, he was also this military leader who had a lot of the security, legitimacy, and credibility that let him make these deals and get a lot of Israelis behind him. So you're not wrong. Watch 2026, and there is a third outcome that's possible there, depending on how the votes happen. A fourth possibility is no one can build a coalition or wants to, which is what we've seen in prior years, and we keep having elections like we had, multiple elections in 4 years, but we'll see. Okay, other questions. What impact does the Iranian nuclear program and whether they develop a weapon capability impact the Middle East trend lines and the Trump administration's aspirational statement? Big impact. So Iran, again, is seen as threat number one among most Israelis, above Hamas or the Palestinians, even after October 7th, because the idea of a state that has much more power than any non-state actor like Iran could threaten the Israelis, especially with a nuclear weapon. That's, threat number one. So it's threat for the Israelis, but also for the Arab states, right? If Iran builds a nuclear weapon, the next states that will want one will be Saudi Arabia, UAE, a bunch of other ones that see Iran as a threat or as a rival. And that can lead to a regional arms race. And as you know, you may believe in like second strike capabilities and mutually assured destruction. But if you do, you also know the nuclearization process, when countries are building nuclear weapons but don't yet have second strike capabilities, is the most unstable time period. So if Iran commits and says, you know what, these strikes by Israel and the US are recommitting us to want to build more of a nuclear program or enrich uranium, can that be a destabilization thing? Yes. At the same time, could it lead to a decrease in that normalization with the Saudis, and maybe the Saudis now feeling like, maybe I need more normalization and tie with the Americans and the Israelis to balance Iran? Possible. So long and short, Iranian nuclear developments for weapons or otherwise has an impact on this stuff, but not exactly clear exactly what direction that would be in. All right, we're at 2 o'clock. I just want to thank you all so much for being here with me, especially those of you who have been with me for all four of these sessions. MIT-MENA is committed to sharing knowledge and engagement on these issues in the Middle East that we all care about, not just in the classroom, but the broader MIT community. So I just want to thank you. It means a lot to me to have you here. You know, I put my heart and soul into learning about this stuff, teaching on this stuff, writing on it, and I'm not perfect, and you don't have to agree with all of my opinions and presentations, but I really welcome the constructive discussion and opinions we have here because I know from the questions otherwise, like people challenge me from different angles, and some of you have very personal ties to the region that you care about. I just want to honor those and say how much the MIT community values the Middle East, North Africa. And I know that even though we have different political positions, all of us want things to be different than they've been the past couple of years. And so let's all hope for that. And let's hope that those aspirational statements I talked about, become reality. I think we can all get behind that. And I would just say that if you like this programming, let folks at MIT-MENA know. And if you have ideas or content or things you want us to cover in the future, please reach out. And I'm sure there'll be more stuff to go on in the future. So thank you again. All the best. And I hope to see you on campus or otherwise soon.